The FBI deals with cases of all kinds and has been doing so for a very long time. Their website is popular for containing a list of the most wanted fugitives in America and some other parts of the world, but they've also been involved in some of the most harrowing crimes in history, some of which took decades to solve. Whenever a war is in progress, forces on each side become increasingly concerned with keeping their tactics and sensitive information safe from the enemy. But at the same time, they try to find ways to extract that same information from the opposing side. This is, of course, where espionage comes into play. During the Cold War, which was fought from the 12th of March 1947 to the 26th of December 1991, American and Soviet forces did everything they could to get the upper hand on each other, including using spies to extract as much data as they possibly could. The Cold War wasn't your typical skirmish, since most of the fighting was done via politics, propaganda, and economics. It came about at the end of World War II, when Britain and America's relationship with the Soviet Union started to crumble. The Soviet Union was concerned that Germany might pose a new threat in the future, and so they started to create left-wing governments in several countries in Eastern Europe. This, in turn, caused concern on the American and British sides, as they started to worry that these governments would be permanently in place. And so, for the next 44 years, they tried to get the better of one another. At the end of the Second World War, Elizabeth Bentley, a Soviet spy who defected to America, approached the FBI to report that certain members of the US government were in fact spying on behalf of the Soviet Union, one of which was a man named Alger Hiss. Bentley's accusations resulted in a scramble from the FBI, as they were determined to keep US secrets safe from those who she had named. By 1947, some details about the case had been leaked to members of the media, and it was being spoken about around the globe. In 1948, the House Committee on Un-American Activities summoned Whittaker Chambers, who was working at Time magazine as a senior editor, to give his testimony in regards to Bentley's claims. Chambers had been a member of the Communist Party up until 1938, after which he decided to relocate his family, going into hiding as he feared for their safety as well as his own. He had initially shown no interest in talking about his activities during his time with the party, but in 1948, he reluctantly decided to do so. He would confess that he had been a part of the communist underground and confirmed Bentley's accusations that Hiss was one of his fellow members, along with others that were pointed out by Bentley, though he had no physical evidence to back up his claims. Chambers claimed that the head of the communist underground organization was a man called Nathan Witt, who worked as an attorney for the National Labor Relations Board, though he was eventually replaced as leader by John Abt. Chambers added that he and Hiss knew each other well and that they'd become good friends over the years, even spending time in his fellow spy's house along with Hiss's wife, Priscilla. He recalled that on the last occasion that he visited Hiss's house, he'd tried to convince him to leave the Communist Party but was unable to do so. Hiss seemed outraged at these claims, immediately hitting back by sending a telegram to the chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, in which he stated that not only did he not know Chambers, but he had never even seen him before. He added that he had no idea why Chambers was making these claims, and that he would appreciate the opportunity to address them in front of a committee. While speaking to the committee, Hiss maintained his stance that Chambers was lying, and with no way of proving otherwise, more pressure was put on Chambers to reveal additional and exact details as far as his interactions with Hiss. Thanks to this, Hiss ultimately admitted that he and Chambers knew each other during the 1930s, but he maintained his stance on his relationship with the Communist Party, reiterating that he had no part in their activities. But his claims would start to unravel in 1948, when Chambers came forward with a set of documents that proved beyond a doubt that both he and Chambers had in fact been involved in espionage in the past. Just a month later, Hiss would be discredited further when Chambers produced pieces of information that became known as the Pumpkin Papers, due to the fact that he had hidden microfilm and other documents inside a pumpkin on his farm. This time, Hiss could no longer deny his involvement with espionage, as the information produced by Chambers included certain papers with information that had been written in his own handwriting. Hiss no longer had anywhere to turn, and he'd been caught in a lie. Luckily for him, the statute of limitations for espionage had already passed, so he couldn't be charged for that crime. But he was charged with perjury instead, since he had lied under oath. An intense investigation was then launched by the FBI to find as much evidence as possible against Hiss, and to confirm the claims that had been made by Chambers against him, so that Hiss could be brought to trial. This was ultimately done successfully, and Hiss's first trial was held in 1949, during which Chambers stated that Hiss first started providing him with State Department documents in 1937, and that he had been instructed by Hiss to take the documents home every night to retype them. Esther Chambers, Whitaker's wife, also testified that Hiss and his wife has visited them at their apartment to celebrate the Hiss couple's wedding anniversary, and even recalled that they arrived with a bottle of champagne in hand, and it seemed as though Hiss would be found guilty. But the jury failed to reach a verdict, and a second trial had to be scheduled for January of the following year. This time, Hiss's defense was that the typewritten documents in question were actually supplied to Chambers by another spy, Julian Wadley. But these claims had little effect on the outcome of the trial. At his second trial, Hiss was found guilty of perjury and ordered to spend 5 years in prison, but Hiss still maintained that he was innocent, stating that the full truth would hopefully come out in the future, and that it would be proven that Chambers had forged many of the documents in question. It's a gut-wrenching feeling to find that you've been scammed out of your hard-earned money by someone who never had your best interests at heart, despite them claiming to do so. Many people have been in this situation, some of whom have been left penniless by scam artists who ran Ponzi schemes. These schemes are designed to convince investors to part with their money in support of non-traditional investments, but the money that they provide is then used to pay back investors who are already involved or to finance the scammer's lavish lifestyle. In the world of Ponzi schemes, there's one man that stands out, Bernie Madoff. Madoff wasn't always a scam artist. After graduating from Brooklyn Law School, he worked as a lifeguard and installed sprinkler systems. He then started his career in trading in 1960 by working on the stock market, where he found good matches between stocks and potential buyers. After finding success, he opened an investment advisory business with the help of his father-in-law, who provided him with clients. Madoff would then take the investors' money and invest in a stock that he thought suited them best. Everything was going well for Madoff, and he was making a lot of money. But when he made one bad decision during a trade, he lost almost all of it, including the money that had been handed over by his investors. Feeling racked with guilt over losing so much of other people's money, Madoff started reporting that he had made trades that were, in reality, completely bogus. But each of his lies just led to another, and before he knew it, he was in over his head with the Ponzi schemes now in full swing. Madoff wasn't just covering up his mistakes with fake trades, though, as there was also a perfectly legal side to his business, which involved convertible bond arbitrage. This involves finding companies that offer bonds at prices that are lower than their stocks. Investors can then buy these bonds, convert them into more expensive stocks, and then sell them again to take advantage of the profit margin. 10 years after losing a fortune in investments, Madoff employed David Kugel to find these low-priced bonds, a role in which he immediately excelled. Madoff seemingly wanted to keep a close eye on Kugel's work, and he asked that he write every detail of his transactions down so that Madoff and his accountant, Annette Bongiorno, could keep track of them, and he did so by keeping his records of his trades on index cards and supplying them to Bongiorno. But just a year after starting to work with Madoff, Kugel started noticing discrepancies that he couldn't explain. When he decided to open a personal account with Madoff's investment advisory company, he waited patiently for his first statement, which he received at the end of the month. But he became suspicious when he realized that some of the trades were not only similar, but exactly the same as some of the convertible bond trades that he'd completed earlier, but had different totals attached to them. Knowing the market as well as he did, Kugel instantly knew that these trades were spurious, since convertible bond arbitrage trades are only available for a few minutes, and since he had completed these transactions, there was no way they could be completed a second time. This sent alarm bells in his head, and he realized that he would be implicated if the truth was to come out. Rather than report the fraudulent activity to the authorities, he decided to keep trading as usual and pocketing the resulting profits. In a very short amount of time, he had accrued millions of dollars, with Madoff allowing him to determine his own salary. Soon, he started buying expensive properties in Long Island, Florida, and he knew that he had the full support of the leader of the scheme, Madoff. But the fraudulent activities didn't stop there. Bongiorno took it one step further by scouring outdated editions of the Wall Street Journal, picking out the stocks that excelled the previous month. He would then whittle that list down to find the stocks that brought in the most profit, fabricate a number of shares that had been bought by an investor, and then add that profit to the investor's statement for the end of the month. Madoff ensured that all of this illegal activity was kept under wraps by setting up a set of rules regarding the Ponzi scheme account. Very few people even knew about it. Even fewer had access to it, and he ensured that the arbitrage trades business's accounts never interacted with the fraudulent one. Investors in the Ponzi scheme were none the wiser, as Madoff made sure that all the numbers seemed legitimate. He kept each client's accounts looking as authentic as possible, just in case two of the investors decided to compare notes. Furthermore, he created a sense of exclusivity for those who joined the scheme by setting the minimum account balance at $1 million. Thanks to this, Madoff never had a shortage of money, and he was certain that he would never be found out, since the scheme was well disguised as part of his arbitrage trades business, which was completely above board. As Madoff's business grew in stature, he hired more staff, all of whom knew about the Ponzi scheme, and this included Madoff's brother Peter. Everything seemed to be going well for the fraudster, as referrals from his retired father-in-law's former business kept rolling in. But in 1992, things started to unravel for Madoff and his employees. The Securities and Exchange Commission started to become suspicious about the business's legitimacy, as Madoff had failed to register it. But this was just the tip of the iceberg, as it was soon revealed that Madoff's father-in-law's old firm was also running a Ponzi scheme. But this firm failed to keep as close an eye on its paperwork as Madoff did, and the statements between the two companies didn't match up, showing discrepancies that totaled over $100 million. He was scrambling for a solution and decided to have the previous 3 years' worth of paperwork forged to match those that had been forged by the business. And unbelievably, it worked. The Securities and Exchange Commission could find no fault with Madoff's paperwork, but the business wasn't as lucky as they were forced to close up shop. But clients had to have their investments refunded, and since they exclusively referred their clients to Madoff, he was the one who had to foot the bill. Madoff's reprieve from the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation was fleeting, as he now didn't have enough money to cover what was owed to his investors, a massive $440 million. Thinking on his feet, Madoff loaned the money and managed to repay what he owed, but since these investors trusted him, most of them just reinvested again straight away, and a further 2,000 investors joined them. But this meant more paperwork that his firm was not able to keep up with. He then decided to follow a strategy devised by Frank DiPascali, a longtime employee of the company. His strategy, called split strike conversion, also hinged on numbers being faked and the stock then being reinvested in treasury bills. This allowed Madoff to avoid being audited by the Securities and Exchange Commission, but people started noticing that something about the business wasn't quite right. 2 computer programmers were added to the payroll to create additional fraudulent documentation, but it only bought him a little time, as the Securities and Exchange Commission informed him in 2004 that his company was being audited. But again, Madoff managed to avoid being found out as the programmers flooded the auditors with paperwork and listed the counterparties as being European. Since the Securities and Exchange Commission didn't have a big budget, they weren't authorized to make international phone calls, and so the counterparties were never authenticated. But a year later, another auditor rolled around. Madoff employed the same strategy of inundating the auditors with documentation, and on one occasion, one of the auditors left his briefcase behind in the office. It contained a list of questions that Madoff would need to answer at some point, and he managed to forge the documents that would answer them satisfactorily. Madoff had slipped through the cracks once more, and would do so 3 more times after that. But when Wall Street started to collapse, his investors fell on hard times, many of whom decided to withdraw the money that they had invested in his company, and he realized that didn't have enough to meet the demand, as he had around $300 million in the bank, but needed to pay out $1.5 billion. It seemed as though the end was near for Madoff and his employees, and he confessed to being a fraudster to his 2 sons. They, in turn, cut all ties with him and reported his dealings to a lawyer, who then contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission. The FBI arrested Madoff the following day. He insisted that he was the only one who knew about the Ponzi scheme, and in March of 2009, he was sentenced to a prison term of 150 years. The investigation that followed lasted 3 long years. Bongiorno was ultimately sentenced to 6 years in prison, while the 2 computer programmers were each ordered to spend 6.5 years behind bars. Many of Madoff's victims had lost all of their life savings and could not be compensated, and they found little comfort in the fact that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. On the 25th of September, 1937, Charles Ross, a 72-year-old wealthy greeting card manufacturer, was headed to Grand Avenue in Chicago. In the car with him was Florence Friage, who he had known for most of his life and who worked as his secretary. He became aware that a car was driving dangerously close to the back of his, but he found it difficult to see who was driving as the car had its high beams on. He decided that the safe thing to do would be to pull over onto the side of the road to let the other car pass, since he assumed the driver was being impatient. As soon as he did so, the other car sped up and passed his, but then it swerved in front of his car and forced him to stop. A man emerged from the car with the firearm in his hand, and he quickly approached Ross's vehicle. He attempted to open the rear passenger door on Ross's side, but found that he couldn't, as it was locked. He then tapped on Ross's window with the firearm in order for him to open the door or risk being harmed. Ross had no choice but to do as he was told, and the man told him to get out of the car. The man searched him and walked him over to the other car, which had a driver ready and waiting. Ross was forced into the vehicle after being told that he was being abducted by the orders of his boss, which prompted Friage to intervene. He told the 2 men that Ross suffered from a heart condition and that he may suffer a medical emergency, but the man would hear none of it. He then stole $85 that Friage had in her purse and ordered her to lie down on the floor of Ross's car. While all of this was happening, she made sure to take a good look at the man, noting that he seemed nervous. He had a pointy face and curly hair. She did as he asked and remained on the floor while the man warned her not to call the police until they had made their getaway, threatening to end Ross's life if she did so. The man sped away with Ross in their car, and Friage did her best to keep up, but the driver of the other car was too fast, and she eventually stopped at a phone booth to call the police. In the meantime, the 2 kidnappers drove to Emily in Minnesota, and eventually stopped at a wooded area where Ross was led to a bunker that they had prepared earlier. The first man then handed Ross a pen and paper, dictating what he wanted him to write down. When told to write down a ransom amount, Ross refused to ask for more than $5,000, but the man changed the amount to $50,000 before returning to Chicago. On the 30th of September, one of Ross's former associates, Harvey Brackett, received the ransom letter, which instructed him to raise the requested amount. A second letter was attached to the first and instructed Brackett to have the money delivered via a motorbike driven by an employee of the Harley-Davidson company. He added that the money was to be placed in a small leather bag, and that the unmarked bills had to be divided up into certain percentages, namely 20% of the ransom in $5 bills, 50% in $10 bills, and the remaining 30% in $20 bills. Further, he ordered that the driver of the motorbike was to drive down a certain highway, which had not been specified yet, after which he was to simply drop the bag. When this was done, he was to flash the bike's lights and drive a further 300 yards before leaving the highway to the left. He also warned that if the driver diverged from this plan, he would pay with his life. When the money had been collected for delivery, an advertisement was to be placed in the Chicago Tribune, listing a used Dodge car for sale, with an added note that the amount of money requested had been raised. The name of the driver of the bike and his address were to be added as well. All of the instructions were followed to the letter, and the ad was placed in the Chicago Tribune as requested. The first kidnapper then returned to the hideout in Minnesota and ordered Ross to hold a newspaper dated the 2nd of October, while he took a photo of him as proof that he was still alive. Following this, the man drove back to Chicago and used a typewriter to create 3 additional ransom notes. The first 2 of these letters were sent to Olden Armitage, another associate of Ross's. This letter instructed him to raise the $50,000 ransom without using Ross's wife's name. Again, a motorbike rider was to deliver the money, but he had to be dressed in all white clothing and would have to drive 500 miles to deliver the money. An ad was to be run in a newspaper again, after which proof of Ross's well-being would be provided. This time, the driver would flash his lights, drive 300 yards, and then leave the bike by the side of the road where he would meet the kidnappers. The ad was placed in the newspaper when the money was ready, after which a fourth ransom note was received, stating that everything was ready and the trade was set to be executed. On the 8th of October, the motorcyclist was to head to different locations set out by the kidnappers, ultimately ending up on Highway 20 near Rockford, Illinois. He did as instructed and was met by the first kidnapper, who drove behind him, flashing his lights when the time came to drop the money. The first kidnapper collected the money and returned to the bunker where the ransom was divided between the two men, the first taking $30,000 while the second took the rest. But the first man would end up ending his hostage and partner's lives, keeping the haul for himself. But the ransom bills were tracked, and the kidnapper, John Henry Seedland, was arrested at the Santa Anita racetrack as he was in the process of betting on a horse. He would eventually confess to the kidnapping. Seedland would be found guilty and ultimately sentenced to be executed on the 14th of July, 1938. It isn't often that a cold case is solved decades after the fact, when the perpetrator in the crime suddenly decides to confess. But this is exactly what happened in the case of Susan Rose, a 24-year-old woman who lost her life in Boston at the hands of a criminal in 1979. Rose had moved to Boston from Jonestown, Pennsylvania, as she didn't see a future for herself in her small hometown. She seemed to fit right in Boston, and on the 30th of October that year, she was out at a bar with some of her friends. At some point in the evening, she left the bar as she needed to collect a cape for her Halloween costume from a friend, and as she did so, she met a man named John Ermer. Ermer took Rose to a building on Beacon Street, which was under renovation, where he assaulted her with a blunt instrument, ending her life. Rose was found the following morning by a group of construction workers who immediately contacted the police. When they arrived at the crime scene, investigators found Rose deceased, along with the cape that she was planning on wearing the following night. They also found her pink raincoat and the contents of her wallet, which had been removed and scattered around the crime scene. Investigators were able to collect a sample of DNA evidence to create an accurate profile of Rose's attacker, but his identity remained a mystery. In 1981, investigators managed to identify a suspect in the case, a man who was known to be a friend of Rose's. He was arrested after a woman came forward to say that the man had confessed to her that he had carried out the attack, after which he was formally charged with ending Rose's life. But the man would ultimately be set free after it came to light that the witness had been drinking heavily and was under the influence of an illegal substance at the time. In an effort to jog her memory, Boston police subjected her to hypnosis, hoping that she would remember exact details from that night. But since this was seen as completely unreliable, the man was acquitted. The case took a further unexpected turn when a woman who was spending time in a psychiatric institution came forward to state that a man she knew had told her that he was, in fact, the one who had carried out the attack. She added that he recounted the crime to her, including details that no one but investigators were privy to. These details had not been released to the press, and so she was convinced that he was telling the truth, but it was later found not to be the case. The case would ultimately go cold, and it seemed as though Rose's killer would get away with this crime, as there were no further witnesses, no additional evidence, and no way of tracking the killer down. For the next 44 years, investigators would revisit the case, only to come up empty each time, as no match had been found for the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene. As the years turned into decades, little hope remained that Rose's killer would be brought to justice. But that all changed in 2023. This is when a man named John Ermer strolled into the Oregon FBI field office and stated that he was the man they were looking for in the 1979 case of the murder of Susan Rose. He was now 68 years old and stated that he could no longer live with the things that he had done in his past, as Rose wasn't his only victim. Ermer had spent time in jail before he was convicted of killing another person in California, for which he received a 30-year jail sentence. He would eventually serve his time and be set free, but after 10 years of freedom, he decided it was time to be truthful about the rest of his crimes. While confessing to the attack on Rose, he added that there was a third victim whose life he had ended somewhere in the South. This claim is currently being investigated, and if they're found to be true, he'll face additional charges. Following his confession, a DNA sample was collected from Irmer and compared to the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene. It was found to be a match, and Irmer's statements had now been confirmed. During his trial, Irmer tried to keep a low profile, seemingly ashamed of the crimes that he had committed. The court heard how, after ending Rose's life, he immediately fled to New York, and how he kept quiet about the attack for the following 44 years. He was ordered to be held without bail, and will be staying behind bars until his sentence is determined. As for Rose's family and friends, they received a small amount of closure from learning who her attacker was, but this comes as little comfort, as they've had to live for more than 4 decades with this nagging question in their minds. It did come as a relief that her attacker would finally face the consequences of his actions, and that he would likely never be released from prison again. Greed can be a powerful motivator, especially when that greed involves money, as people have been known to go to extraordinary lengths, including murder, to add to their bank accounts. When oil was struck on the Osage Indian Reservation in Oklahoma in the 1800s, it set into motion a series of events that would bring about the demise of an entire family, save for one member. The oil industry is an extremely lucrative one, but it's also been known to be riddled with controversy. Anyone who strikes oil is virtually guaranteed to make an absolute fortune, and so it comes as no surprise that some people would do anything within their power to keep as much of that money for themselves. After oil was struck on the reservation, its inhabitants, the Osage Nation, profited by receiving royalties as the oil was selling very quickly. As time went by, the oil market kept growing exponentially, and in a very short amount of time, people from all over the country traveled to the area in hopes that they too could share in the profits somehow. And some would go further than others, even resorting to murder. In May of 1921, one of the reservation's inhabitants, a woman named Anna Brown, was found deceased in a ravine in Oklahoma. Her life had been ended with a firearm, and the crime was a complete mystery to investigators, as she was well liked and no one could think of any reason why someone would want to harm her. The case would soon become far more sinister though, when Anne's mother, Lizzie Q, lost her life under suspicious circumstances just 2 months after Anna had been attacked. The family would endure further tragedy 2 years later, when Anna's cousin, Henry Rohn, was found deceased. He had also been attacked with a firearm. Just a few months later, Anna's sister Rita Smith and her husband Bill also lost their lives when they were attacked at their home. But still, there were no suspects, and investigators were at a loss as to who could be carrying out the crimes. Just one member of the family, Molly Burkhart, remained alive, but she had suddenly become ill with a long-lasting illness that no one was able to explain. The family had been decimated, but the attacker remained elusive, and no clues were found that helped identify them. As if this wasn't bad enough, the body count continued to increase, when at least 24 more people were found deceased in that area. Most of the victims were members of the Osage Native American tribe, but soon more bodies were found, one of which was a well-known oil businessman. Some people had theories on what was going on, but as soon as they came forward to reveal what they suspected, they lost their lives. One of these victims was an attorney called W.W. Vaughn, who lost his life when he was thrown from a moving train. News of the attacks spread like wildfire, and soon the story was being covered by well-known media outlets, but the attacker still remained unidentified. Several private detectives were brought in to try to crack the case, but with very little evidence to go on, they were unable to do so, prompting the Osage Tribunal Council to hold a meeting. In 1923, they decided to contact the federal government for help in finding the culprit, and the FBI, then known simply as the Bureau of Investigation, stepped in to see if they could find a much-needed break in the case. When it came to light that one man, William Hale, who was also known as the King of Osage Hills, had been involved with unscrupulous activities in the past, including bribery, theft, and intimidation, he was quickly named as a suspect. Hales was originally a cattleman, but traveled to Oklahoma where he amassed a sizable fortune with the use of his dubious tactics. He was known as a greedy man who was always looking to add to his bank account, and when he learned that oil had been found on the reservation, he saw an opportunity that he couldn't pass up. It was also found that Hale's nephew was married to Molly, the ailing remaining member of Anna's family. It became clear that Hales had done his homework, since he knew that he would stand to gain as much as $500,000 each year if Anna's family perished in a certain order. Anna first, then her mother, then her sisters. But with no solid leads to follow, they decided to focus on one of the crimes, the murder of Anna's cousin, Henry Rowan, since he had lost his life on restricted Native American land, meaning they would be able to enforce jurisdiction. Each of the agents conducted their own separate investigations while disguised as a cattle buyer, oil prospector, insurance salesman, and herbal healer respectively. They would secretly meet up every so often to compare notes, and before long they had a list of 3 names that seemed to crop up over and over again. The 3 men were William Hale, Ernest Burkhardt, and John Ramsey. They now had a starting point in the case and started putting pressure on the 3 men, with Burkhardt being brought in for questioning first. He quickly buckled and confessed that Hale had hired Ramsey to end Rowan's life. When Ramsey was questioned next, he confirmed Burkhardt's statements, but shockingly also admitted Hale had hired him to end the lives of Rita and Bill Smith. The floodgates had seemingly opened during Ramsey's confession, as he added that Hale was the mastermind in the Smith attack, and that 2 other men, Asa Kirby and Henry Grammer, were also involved. But there was no way of proving that these 2 men were part of the crimes, as they both had lost their lives under what was considered suspicious circumstances, soon after the Smiths had been attacked. It was known that they were both criminals, and it seemed likely that Ramsey's statements were true. With Ramsey and Burkhardt's confessions secured, the agents moved to have both men and Hale taken into custody. Hale insisted that he was in no way involved in the heinous crimes, and Ramsey decided to recant his confession. But they were brought to trial nonetheless, along with Kelsey Morrison and Burkhardt's brother, Byron. The trials that followed garnered nationwide coverage in the press, while they continued for 3 years from 1926 to 1929. The trials were held in Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Pawhuska, and Bartlesville, and in 1926, Burkhardt decided to plead guilty, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison for his role in the attack on the Smith family. He would then turn on his accomplices, deciding to become a witness for the state against both Hale and Ramsey for their roles in ending Henry Rowan's life. They would both also receive life sentences. Kelsey Morrison would then confess that he was the one who ended Anna's life, after he had been asked to do so by Hale, the ringleader. He would also be sent to prison for the rest of his life, though he was already incarcerated for another crime at the time. Burkhardt's brother, Byron, also turned state witness and was set free after testifying against his fellow criminals. Strangely, the 3 main antagonists in the crimes, Hale, Burkhardt, and Ramsey, would eventually successfully apply for parole, and Burkhardt would eventually receive a full pardon. The mystery of the Osage murders had finally been solved, but many people feel that justice wasn't fully served, as the 3 men responsible all eventually found freedom again. In the early 2010s, Darios Mikosi moved from his native Poland to the UK in search of a better life. Darios left his wife and children behind to obtain work so that he could send money home. Those who knew Darios described him as a kind and hardworking man who was wholly devoted to his family. In 2011, the unthinkable would happen when Darios disappeared without a trace. It would take almost 10 years for the truth to be revealed, finally, thanks to a star witness. When Darios arrived in Huddersfield, England in the 2010s, he was surprised at how friendly the locals were. Darios was welcomed into their circles with open arms and made fast friends at work. Darios had previously worked as a police officer in his native Poland and certainly knew how to handle himself. A slice of home wasn't too far away, as Darios shared a home with Adam Tolinski, also from Poland, and one other man. The Polish community in Huddersfield also welcomed Darios with open arms, and soon he was involved with Ernest Weber and his brother Piotr. When Darios called home to his wife and children, he told them how he had slotted into his new life with ease. Little did Darios know that the welcome would be short-lived. He'd picked up casual work for Piotr and Ernest, who owned a garage just outside of the city. On March 13, 2011, Ernest and Piotr arrived at the flat Darios shared with Adam Tolinski. The men shared drinks and played card games, chatting away into the night. By the early morning hours, the Weber brothers returned home, and Adam went to bed. When Adam awoke the next morning, he noticed that Darius was missing. It would take several days for Darius's disappearance to be noticed by other friends and family, at which time he was reported missing to the police. Naturally, Adam was interviewed at length, as he'd been among the last people to see Darius. Likewise, the Weber brothers were also interviewed, but none of them could offer up any information about Darius's whereabouts. Within weeks, the case ran cold, and it appeared as though Darius had disappeared into thin air, but the truth was far worse. Adam, Ernest, and Piot continued to push for Darius's case to be in the local spotlight, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Many years would go by without a word, but then in 2020, something bizarre happened. A new anonymous tip came forward, someone claiming to have been with Darius the night that he disappeared. This new witness claimed that Piot, Adam, and Ernest had taken Darius's life before burying him in a remote area near the McSinden Reservoir. Desperate, investigators summoned forensic teams and cadaver dogs to the site to begin their search. Within a matter of days, they discovered the remains of Darius. The anonymous witness claimed that on March 13, 2011, Ernest, Adam, and Piot attacked Darius after he threatened to tell the police about illegal operations that were happening at Ernest's garage. Over the course of several hours, Ernest, Adam, and Piot kicked and punched Darius. At one point, Darius was forced to eat ash and cigarette butts from an ashtray. Adam Tolinsky left later that morning, but the assault on Darius did not stop. Eventually, his body gave up and he succumbed to the many injuries inflicted upon him at the hands of the men he believed to be his friends. Once Darius had passed away, Piot covered his body in caustic soda to speed up the decomposition process. He then aided his brother in the disposal of his body. The three men were extraordinarily calculated and formulated a plan to throw the police off their trail. It would be them that reported Darius missing, knowing full well what had really happened to him. They continued living as if nothing had happened, all while consoling Darius's distraught wife. Upon the discovery of his body and the testimony of the anonymous witness, the three men's plan fell apart. In 2023, 3 years after the witness came forward, Piot, Ernest, and Adam were arrested and charged with Darius's disappearance. For his involvement in the disposal of Darius's remains, Piot was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Following the testimony of the star witness, the courts found Adam and Ernest guilty of homicide. The two were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. Darius's wife made a statement to the court describing how the case had affected not only her but her daughter, who was very young when her father disappeared. She said, quote, "She would very often wake up at night crying, thinking her dad was lying next to her. Things became more upsetting when we learned my husband's life had been taken in such a cruel way. This was a terrible wrench and a huge shock. We could not get over it." April 20th, 1996 would be the day the notion of safety and serenity for the residents of Long Island would be rocked. The discovery of partial remains would send residents into a tailspin. To make matters worse, the remains lay unidentified, adding to the horror of the situation. Many years later, the community would be rocked by a similar discovery, this time on a much larger scale. It wasn't until 2023 that the truth would finally come out, and residents could sleep soundly at night. On April 20th, 1996, people walking along the Blue Point Beach on Fire Island, a small island off the shore of Long Island, saw something in the sand. As they grew nearer, their stomachs dropped and reality set in. What lay before them were a pair of legs wrapped in a black plastic trash bag. Authorities were immediately called to the scene, and the full scope of the discovery was realized. According to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office, the legs belonged to a white woman aged 18 to 50. The remains had some soft tissue and skin left on them, and it was clear that they'd been there for several days. The right leg had a notable 3.5-inch scar, and a 1-inch scar, and a 1/2-inch scar around the ankle. Similarly, the left leg featured a 2-inch surgical scar on the left ankle. The toenails had been painted red. The medical examiner determined that the woman had likely undergone surgery on her left ankle and possibly her right. This fact was cross-referenced with local missing person cases, but no possible matches came to light. A wide-scale search of Blue Point Beach was coordinated, but investigators failed to find the rest of her remains. As weeks passed, interest in the case waned, and no new clues had come to light. The Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office dubbed the remains the Fire Island Jane Doe. It wouldn't be until April 12, 2011, that the full extent of the serial killer epidemic of Long Island was exposed. Between December of 2010 and April of 2011, the remains of at least 11 people were uncovered along Ocean Parkway. Each day that investigators headed to the site, they discovered more bones. Eventually, the victim count stood at 11. These victims were found to be the work of the now-named Long Island serial killer. Thankfully, most of these victims were quickly identified as young women who were known to work the streets of Long Island, but not all the victims were so lucky. On April 12th, investigators excavating the site along Ocean Parkway discovered a skull close to Tobay Beach. Thanks to DNA and forensic science, investigators were able to link this skull to the legs found 2 decades earlier in 1996. Unfortunately, by the time investigators found the skull, they were unable to tell any distinguishing features and could only ascertain that it belonged to a white woman, aged 18 to 50. This discovery should have hailed new leads, but it only served to complicate the case further. In the background, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer intensified. By 2023, investigators announced that 59-year-old Rex Hauerman had been arrested in connection with the case. This announcement sent the true crime world into a tailspin, as the Lisk case had been one of the most highly publicized cases of all time. But 2023 didn't just bring the arrest of the Lisk, though, and weeks after Rex Hauerman was arrested, the Suffolk County Sheriff's Office had another announcement to make. They had identified the Fire Island Jane Doe as 34-year-old Karen Vergata of Manhattan, New York. Karen was last seen on February 14, 1996 in Manhattan, and heartbreakingly, nobody ever reported her missing. Karen was a known street worker, and she was quickly forgotten about. Months later, her legs were found on Fire Island, but investigators didn't connect the dots. Decades later, her skull was located 15 miles from where the rest of her remains had been discovered. The identification was facilitated by Othram, who worked in conjunction with the FBI to perform genetic genealogy testing. Once a DNA profile was obtained, Othram and the FBI found living relatives who submitted a DNA sample. It was confirmed in late 2022 that the remains belonged to Karen Vergata, and the official announcement was made in 2023. The trial against Rex Hauerman is currently ongoing and is said to be one of the most publicized trials in modern U.S. history. 28-year-old Vicky Lynn Belk was described as a loving, devoted mother to her son who would have done anything to protect him. Vicky came from an accomplished and proud family in Alexandria, Virginia, and she was determined to have the same upbringing for her son. Vicky was doing well at work and was happy in her personal life. So why did she disappear mysteriously one evening in August of 1979? Vicky and her sister Judy held the distinction of being the first black students to attend Mickey Howard Elementary after their parents had fought valiantly for their place. The Belks had filed a civil rights lawsuit that forced the school to desegregate, and the two girls were allowed to attend. The Belks placed high importance on education, and by the 1970s, Vicky had finished school with stellar grades. After leaving school, Vicky earned herself a role as a management analyst for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in nearby Washington, D.C. Vicky was incredibly proud of her achievements and excelled in her role. While Vicky's role was demanding, she always found time for her family and her faith. The Belks would gather every Sunday at church and enjoy each other's company. On August 27, 1979, Vicky arrived at work normally and went about her workday. That afternoon, Vicky told coworkers that she was stepping out of the office to run a few errands that would take her no more than a few hours. The afternoon quickly morphed into the evening, and Vicky's coworkers were puzzled. Many assumed she had headed home after running errands, but this was not the case. Vicky's mother, Maydell, who had been looking after her son while she attended work, instantly knew something was wrong. Vicky had never failed to return home before without calling. Later that evening, Maydell arrived at the Charles County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing, only to be told she needed to wait 72 hours before the report could be filed. Frustrated, Maydell and the Belks took to the streets themselves in a desperate search for Vicky. On August 28, 1979, a teenager riding his bike along Bryans and Metropolitan Church roads in Charles County saw something in the woods. As he grew nearer, he discovered the body of a black female who had suffered a shot to the head. The teenager ran to the nearest home, and within minutes, the Charles County Sheriff's Office was at the scene. Vicky had been found lying on her back with her hands clenched into fists. It was clear that she had tried to fight off her attacker as he assaulted her before delivering the final blow. The Charles County Sheriff's Office identified the body as belonging to Vicky Bell, whose family had tried to report her missing hours prior. The news of Vicky's passing hit the community hard. Vicky was an active member in Charles County and Alexandria, and residents vowed to put the person responsible behind bars for the rest of their lives. In 1979, DNA evidence was not yet available to investigators, and Vicky's case quickly went cold. It would remain that way until 2022, when the Charles County Sheriff's Office decided to re-examine the evidence found at the crime scene. In the early 2000s, forensic investigators had tried to obtain a DNA profile from Vicky's dress and slip, but technology had not yet advanced far enough, and no matches were found. Now, in 2022, using new technologies, forensic investigators were able to obtain a new male DNA profile from Vicky's dress and slip. This DNA profile was entered into CODIS, and weeks later, a match returned. In July of 2023, the Charles County Sheriff's Office announced that they had arrested 62-year-old Andre Taylor in connection with Vicky's case. In August of 1979, Andre was just 18 years old when he launched his brutal attack on Vicky. In the years since, Andre has amassed many more convictions, and in 1989, he was charged with shooting a man in Washington, D.C. Andre's DNA had been entered into CODIS due to these charges, but it wasn't until 2022, when the new DNA profile was developed, that answers finally came. As of November of 2023, the case against Andre is currently ongoing, and according to the Washington Post, he's being held without bail or bond. Andre Taylor is possibly looking at a life sentence without parole. February 3rd, 1990, was a day that changed the lives of several loggers forever. That morning, as the men prepared for work, they could not anticipate the discovery that they would make. 3 decades later, the answer to the question on everyone's lips that day would finally be answered thanks to advances in forensic science and police investigation. Early that cold February morning, loggers drove their vehicles down through Hefin, Alabama. As the men chatted amongst themselves, talking about the day ahead, one of them spotted something off Evans Bridge Road. At first, the object in the wooded area was indistinguishable, but as the men grew closer, their eyes widened with horror. Laying amongst the trees were the partial skeletal remains of an adult woman. According to reports, the skull was the first part to be found, with several ribs and other bones being located minutes later. The loggers dropped their tools and ran to the nearest home or business looking to use their phone, and minutes later, the Hefin Police Department arrived at the scene and took over the search. After several hours, the partial skeletal remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. In their report, the medical examiner noted that the remains belonged to a white woman, aged 22 to 34, with brown hair, pierced ears, 5 foot to 5'4", and 100 to 120 pounds. Unfortunately, the medical examiner could not determine how the young woman had perished, but believed it to be suspicious in nature. The report also detailed how the woman wore a lower removable orthodontic retainer and was found wearing a white bra, a tattered shirt that had decomposed with the remains, and disintegrated underwear that read "Jockey for her" in a size 4. She was also found with yellow gold hoop earrings. Unfortunately, none of the clothes bore name tags or significant identifying features that would help investigators further down the line. Investigators tried to compare the remains to known local missing persons, but no matches could be ascertained. Details of the discovery were broadcast around Claiborne County, and while residents watched the case closely, nobody came forward with any information. Soon, the case of the Hefin Jane Doe fell silent. Investigators of Claiborne County never forgot about the young woman and vowed to solve the case. Decades after she was discovered, the LSU Faces organization created an approximation sketch of the Hefin Jane Doe, depicting a woman with wavy brown hair, dark eyes, and strong features. This sketch helped to reignite the case and breathed an air of hope into the case. Shortly after LSU Faces created the sketch, the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences also became involved in the case. The ADFS worked with the Hefin Police Department, who in 2022 officially reopened the case. In 2023, the ADFS and Hefin Police Department consulted with Othram, a forensic genetic genealogy company in Texas. According to a press release, a DNA sample was submitted to Othram, who began genealogical testing. Within weeks, Othram had found the possible daughter of the victim. This woman was contacted and agreed to submit a DNA sample. Finally, in October of 2023, Othram and the Hefin Police Department announced that the Hefin Jane Doe had been identified as 41 to 42-year-old Clara Kopp Reynolds of Georgia. According to reports, Clara was last seen sometime in 1988 or 1989 in the company of an unnamed male friend. The two were reportedly traveling to Florida, although it's unclear whether the pair ever made it there. While an exact cause can't be determined, investigators have now classified her case as a homicide and are eager to speak with the male friend last seen with her. Clara's remains will be returned to her family for a proper burial. Anyone with information in this case is urged to contact the Hefin Police Department at HPD tip line at cityofheflin.org or at 256-463-2291. February 14, 1988 started out innocently for two men searching for cans in dumpsters in Millen, Georgia. Just minutes into their expedition, things would take a drastic turn. What the two men uncovered that day would kickstart a mystery that spanned 3 decades and was finally solved thanks to forensic genetic genealogy. On February 14, 1988, two men searching for cans to recycle in Millen, Georgia, came across a dumpster off Kaiser Road and Old Perkins Road. The dumpster appeared to be full, and the two believed that they'd hit a gold mine. While one of the men waited in the car, the other headed to the trash to collect the cans. As the men dug further, he came closer to the source of the foul smell that had been emanating from the bin. After a few minutes of diving, he came across a large nylon duffel bag that contained something solid. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the bag. And inside, wrapped in bedding, plastic, and sealed with tape, were the remains of a young woman. Horrified at what he had discovered, the man ran back to his car and summoned the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to the scene. The woman's body was recovered from the bin and transferred to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. During the initial autopsy, the medical examiner estimated that the remains belonged to a white, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American female, aged 18 to 25, with black hair, 5'4" to 5'6", and 135 to 145 pounds. The medical examiner estimated that she had been deceased for 4 to 7 days and had likely perished due to asphyxiation. Bizarrely, the woman's feet had been bound, but the rest of her body remained untied. Inside the duffel bag, investigators also found a light green pillow, a maroon bedspread, a light blue towel with a butterfly design, and a half-full gas canister. The prevailing theory was that the ornate green pillow found with the woman was used to asphyxiate her, though no physical evidence was found to prove this theory. According to the Doe Network, investigators with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations had potentially tracked the bedspread found with the woman to either North or South Korea, which lent itself to the idea that she was Asian or of mixed heritage. The only other distinguishable identifying feature that the woman had was her teeth. Her upper teeth were crooked, and there was evidence of a lower molar extraction shortly before her passing. According to the Doe Network, the woman's teeth showed signs of winging, which is present in Asian and Native American people. Shortly after the GBI took over the case, her remains were cremated before a DNA sample could be obtained. Disappointingly, only one fingerprint was recovered from the woman, and this didn't match anyone present in federal or local systems. Without any more leads to work with, the woman was dubbed Jane Millen Doe. 3 years after Jane Millen Doe was discovered, investigators received their first and only lead. One evening, a call came in to the local police from a man who confessed to taking Jane Doe's life. While the man didn't state his name, investigators believe the man to have been Johnny Young, who was named as a potential suspect back in 1988. Shortly before Jane Doe was found, Johnny Young was seen with an Asian woman who fit the description of Jane Doe. Other witnesses also recalled seeing a middle-aged couple throwing a bag into the dumpster where Jane was found on February 12, 1988. As Jane Doe's remains had been cremated, not buried, investigators held out little hope that she would ever be identified. That was until 2023, when the GBI partnered with Othram. According to their press release, Othram was able to extract a DNA profile from the bag and other evidence found in 1988. Using this new DNA profile, Othram performed genetic genealogical research and discovered a possible candidate. Family members of the possible match were contacted, and by October 23, 2023, Othram had finally uncovered the decades-long mystery. The remains found in February of 1988 belonged to 26-year-old Chong Eun Kim of Hinesville, Georgia. Kim moved to the US in 1981 and lived in Hinesville until 1988. Now the GBI is trying to find the person responsible and ensure that justice is served. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Georgia Bureau of Investigation at 912-871-1121. Some cold cases leave investigators baffled for decades, even though they have witness accounts, 911 call recordings, and evidence from the crime scene to follow up on. It's often the case that investigators are certain who committed the crime, but have no way of proving it. But sometimes the truth is revealed much later, when a tiny piece of new evidence sheds light on the case. This seems to be the case in the 2010 investigation into the murder of Heidi Fergus, a 25-year-old woman who was living in St. Paul, Minnesota at the time. She was living with her husband, 27-year-old Nick Fergus, whom she met during her high school years when she was a freshman and he was a junior. The couple decided to get married in 2005, after which Nick started working for his father, who owned a carpet cleaning company. After working several menial jobs, Heidi eventually found a full-time job at a financial services company called Securian. Heidi's brother, Pete Erickson, later told the media that at the time their family was very happy about the couple's marriage, as they seemed to be a perfect fit for each other. And soon, things started to look even better, as the couple bought their first home in 2007 and their future looked bright. But it wouldn't take long for financial troubles to set in, as they had to resort to taking out 2 mortgages by the next year. By 2009, their house had been sold at a sheriff's auction, but this wouldn't be the last time that financial troubles regarding their house would crop up. Heidi's case started on a Sunday morning, the 25th of April, 2010, when she made a frenzied call to 911. She told the dispatcher that someone was trying to break into the couple's home, but before the dispatcher could get any details out of Heidi, she heard a loud noise coming from the background and the line went dead. Just over a minute later, another call came in from the same location, and this time it was Nick who was on the line. He was frantic and yelled that someone had made it into their house, adding that Heidi had been attacked by the intruder and that she was injured from a firearm discharge. He added that both he and Heidi had suffered injuries caused by the firearm and that they needed assistance. Nick would go on to make a full recovery, but unfortunately Heidi wasn't as lucky, as she lost her life at the scene. When Nick was interviewed by investigators, they asked him to describe the events that transpired that morning. He then stated that he was asleep in bed when he became aware of a strange noise at their house's front door, and so he grabbed his own firearm, told Heidi that something strange was going on, and went to investigate. He added that he saw what he thought was an African-American man in the house, though he couldn't be sure about this detail. He was also unsure about exactly what happened next, but he believed that during a struggle that ensued, his finger slipped down the firearm, causing it to discharge twice, and this was the cause of his wife's passing. The surrounding area was searched with the help of a canine unit in case any clues had been left behind by the intruder, but none were found. The only evidence they'd followed up on was Nick's account of the events that transpired, and soon investigators thought they knew who the intruder was. The man closely matched the description that Nick gave of the would-be robber, but he was quickly cleared of any wrongdoing in the case when it was discovered that he was serving time in prison when the attack took place. Nick also revealed that he and Heidi were in deep financial trouble and that their house had been foreclosed on. They'd been ordered to move out the following day, and he explained that they planned to pack the house up that morning and that they would have left some of their belongings in the house's garage while looking for a place to stay. But investigators could find no evidence that Heidi knew about the foreclosure, prompting them to search through the couple's text messages and emails to each other. But still, there was no mention of the financial difficulties or foreclosure on their home. 2 years after the incident, Nick married Rachel Watson, who was one of Heidi's friend's sisters. They started a family together and were lucky enough to move into a house that was paid for by Nick's parents. He and Rachel decided it would be best to pay the mortgage straight to his parents, and that he would then pay any property taxes to the county. But Rachel found out that Nick was not keeping his part of the deal when she discovered a letter in one of his drawers stating that the house was about to be foreclosed on. Realizing that Nick had been keeping this detail from her, she confronted him and decided to record their conversation. In one of the recordings, she made it clear that she now had doubts about what had happened to Heidi, and that she was starting to suspect that Nick was responsible for her passing. Nick and Rachel's relationship would only deteriorate from there, and would eventually get divorced in 2018. The case still hadn't seen any progress by this point, but one investigator, Sergeant Nicole Sipes, decided to revisit the case, as it had always bothered him that the details given by Nick seemed spurious. The 911 call that was made by Heidi was analyzed for sounds of a third person in the house, but there were none. It was also found that the firearm had very likely been discharged on purpose, placing the spotlight firmly on Nick as the prime suspect in his former wife's demise. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but he maintains his innocence to this day, as does his family, who's released a statement in which they claim the wrong man has been accused of the heinous crime. Nick was eventually found guilty and sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars, and he'll not be given the opportunity to apply for parole. One of the greatest advancements in DNA technology is the use of familial DNA, where potential relatives of a person whose DNA has been collected can be identified. This has not only helped investigators find perpetrators who left DNA at crime scenes, but has aided in identifying John and Jane Does, people who were found deceased with no way of identifying them. One such case occurred in 1995, when an unidentified 19-year-old man lost his life in a car accident, and due to the fact that he had concert tickets to a Grateful Dead concert, he became known as Grateful Doe. For the next 20 years, no one had any idea who the man was, and no one came forward to claim his remains. But DNA was collected and stored in the hope that someone could be linked to him in the future, and this is exactly what happened. But this mystery wasn't solved solely with the help of familial DNA. As years went by without Grateful Doe being identified, internet users took it upon themselves to spread information on the case as far and wide as possible. And in 2015, their efforts paid off. A woman named Shannon Michelson and members of her family thought they recognized the man and immediately contacted the police to find out if the man was a relative of theirs, a man named Jason Callahan, who was reported missing after he didn't return home, after saying that he was planning on following the Grateful Dead while they were on tour. Several members of the family provided DNA samples, which were then compared to the deceased man's. The results came back as a positive match, and the Grateful Doe mystery had finally been solved after 20 years. But it's far more common for this technology to be used after a crime was committed, as there's always a chance that the perpetrator left some DNA evidence behind, no matter how small an amount. But in the case of the murder of Terren Pette, a convenience store manager from Orlando, Florida, crime scene investigators didn't have to look too hard to find this type of evidence, since the perpetrator injured himself during his attack and had no way of preventing his DNA from staying behind at the scene. The incident took place on the 3rd of February, 1996 at the Lil Champ convenience store, which was located in Orange County. Terrence, who was 31 years old at the time, was the only employee at the store and was working 60-hour shifts in the weeks before the attack. He'd been living in Orlando for a few years, and he didn't have many friends in the area at the time. On that morning, he arrived at the store between 5 and 6 a.m. as he usually did, since the store opened at 6 a.m. every morning, but he was attacked shortly afterward. A call was made at around 6:55 a.m. to deputies by a member of the public who noticed that the store's lights had not been turned on, which they found unusual, and luckily they didn't decide to investigate on their own. When investigators arrived, they found Terrence deceased inside the store's bathroom, and they determined that his life had been ended with a blade. The crime scene was described by investigators as being covered in biological material that was found on the store's lottery machine, the doors, the freezer, and floors. They noted that the attacker didn't simply flee after the attack, but moved through the store as if they were looking for something specific before making their getaway. The police appealed to anyone who may have seen something out of the ordinary that morning to come forward with any information they had, but this led to nothing as there were seemingly no witnesses to the attack. Investigators did their best to try to find someone who would have had motive to commit this heinous crime, but despite DNA evidence being collected at the scene, they had very little to go on, and eventually the case went cold. As is often the case, the Orange County Sheriff's Office decided to take another look at the case a few years later in 2003, but the DNA that was collected only served to move the case along very slightly, as they were able to eliminate a few suspects who did not match to the DNA found in the store. Terrence's case went cold once again, and it started to look as though his killer would get away with his crime after all. For the next 16 years, nothing more could be done, but Terrence's case was not forgotten. In 2019, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was approached by the Orange County Sheriff's Office, which asked them to assist in the case, as DNA technology had come along in leaps and bounds over the previous few years. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement then made contact with Othram, an organization that deals with processing of forensic genetic genealogy, and the DNA collected at the crime scene was provided for processing. In this case, forensic-grade genome sequencing was used to create a genetic profile of the perpetrator, which was then sent back to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They then, in turn, used this profile to create a genetic genealogical profile, and before long, they had a solid lead as a suspect was identified. Kenneth Robert Stoff Jr., a 54-year-old man from Eustis, Florida, was found to be a match after DNA from the crime scene matched closely with that of his parents. When it then came to light that Stoff once worked at the same convenience store in the past, and that he'd been living across the road from the store at the time of the attack, it became clear that he was likely the one who ended Terrence's life. Investigators then collected discarded beer cans from outside Stoff's apartment, which still contained traces of his DNA, and this was quickly matched to the DNA found inside the store. He was taken into custody 23 years after he had carried out the crime, and was charged with robbery with a deadly weapon and first-degree murder, and he was held without bail. At his trial, the jury returned a guilty verdict, which was never really in doubt given the undeniable evidence that he left behind, and he was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 56. Terrence's case had finally been brought to a close, and Stoff will now have to face the consequences of his actions. Sometimes, when a crime is committed, investigators have a fairly good idea of who the perpetrator was, but they have no solid evidence to confirm their suspicions, and no choice but to let them go free without charging them of a crime. Some of these criminals are never brought to task for their actions, as they either pass away before evidence is found, or they escape to another country where they can stay out of the long reach of the arm of the law. But as was the case in the murder of Noel Russo, a 37-year-old woman from California, some cases are finally solved many years after the fact, thanks to the committed efforts of those who dedicate themselves to solving cold cases such as this. Noel was a graduate from Burlingame High School in California, and is remembered as being a former beauty pageant winner who took the crown at the Miss Burlingame pageant when she was 16 years old in 1962. After being declared the winner, she told the San Mateo Times newspaper that she was shocked and surprised, as she never expected to win and only entered the pageant because her mother asked her to. After graduating high school, she married twice, but both relationships ended in divorce. Before enrolling at college, she trained to be a forest ranger for a short while, and her friends and family described her as being bubbly and always up for a chat. In 1983, she was studying at Santa Rosa Junior College, and living on Avram Avenue in an apartment she shared with her son, who at the time was 18 years old. She had also mentioned to friends that she was considering moving to Boys Hot Springs, but never got the chance as her life was tragically cut short. On the 24th of June, 1983, Noel showed up at a house belonging to one of her friends after she'd gotten into a heated argument with her boyfriend. Her friend invited her to stay over for the night, and she agreed that it would be a good idea. What followed next isn't exactly clear, as there are conflicting statements about what Noel and her friend did for the rest of the night, up until the last time she was seen alive. Some sources state that her friend later drove her to Courthouse Square, which is situated in Santa Rosa. Here, she was meant to get on a bus to return to her own house in Rohnert Park, but she never made it there. Other sources state that the two friends decided to go out for the night, stopping in at several bars in the area while doing so. The two then became separated, and some witnesses state that Noel was seen talking to an ex-boyfriend of hers, but this has never been confirmed. There have also been reports that she missed her bus and then accepted a ride from someone, but again, this is mere speculation and has never been proven to be true. Whatever the case may be, Noel was supposed to catch the bus home at some stage, and she was indeed dropped off at Courthouse Square to do so. But before she could make her way onto the bus, she was attacked and her life was ended. The next day, Noel's friend tried to contact her but was unable to do so. And just a few days after that, her worst fears were confirmed when Noel was found deceased at the intersections of East Cotati Drive and Pentaluma Hill Road. Investigators noticed a pile of wood near the crime scene, and they quickly determined that one of these pieces of lumber was used to end her life. Along with this, they also collected several other pieces of evidence from the crime scene, including DNA samples, but these were of no use at the time. A sketch artist was brought in to create a sketch of Noel in the clothing that she was wearing at the time that she was attacked, and this image was circulated around the area in hopes that it would jog someone's memory that may have seen something that night, but no witnesses came forward. They also conducted several interviews and were able to create a list of people of interest, but without any solid proof, they were unable to charge anyone with the crime, and eventually Noel's case went cold. But the investigation into her passing always continued, and as the years passed, investigators kept submitting DNA evidence from the crime scene to the Santa Clara County Crime Lab, as well as the Serological Research Institute. For 13 years, from 2010 to 2023, no matches were found, and hope started to dwindle that the perpetrator in Noel's case would ever be identified. But in 2023, detectives got the break that they'd been waiting for decades. Incredibly, one of the original persons of interest, a man named Alfredo Carretero Jr., was found to be a match for the DNA that was collected at the murder site, and investigators scrambled to obtain a warrant for his arrest. After being taken into custody, Carretero was held without bail at the Santa Rosa Detention Center, and his trial date was set for the 19th of October. It would then come to light that this wasn't the first time that Carretero had a run-in with the law, as he was involved in a case of domestic violence in 1985, 2 years after he had ended Noel's life. Investigators have opted not to release any further details in the case, including whether they suspect Carretero of being involved in any other similar cases in the area. It isn't known whether he and Noel knew each other at the time of the attack, but further details are expected to be revealed as the case develops in the future. A set of skeletal remains was found by a snorkeler on the 25th of December 2017. The man was snorkeling at Shallow Inlet at Sandy Point in Victoria, Australia, when he stumbled across the remains, which were noted to be surprisingly well preserved. But no clothing or any personal belongings were found, and the skeleton no longer contained any tissue, making it harder for investigators to determine who it belonged to. The skeleton was sent to the Victorian Institute for Forensic Medicine, where they were then kept in case more information came to light in the future. But not all was lost, as scientists from the Victorian Institute were able to learn at least a few things from the remains. They found that they likely belonged to a Caucasian man who was between 21 and 37 at the time of his passing, and that he was around 5 foot 5 inches tall. He was named the Sandy Point Doe. When the man's dental records were checked by an odontologist, it was speculated that the man may have originally lived abroad, since the style of dental work that had been performed on him wasn't familiar. There was also the possibility that the work was simply outdated and that the man passed away a long time ago. The last theory was then proven when radiocarbon dating was performed on the remains, and it became ever more likely that the man lost his life sometime between 1666 and 1942, which didn't narrow it down very much but eliminated the possibility that he had ended up in the ocean in recent times. Luckily, the remains were still intact enough for scientists to create a nuclear and mitochondrial DNA profile. The results of this were sent to the Victorian Missing Persons DNA database in hopes that the case could be closed swiftly, but this was not the case, as no positive match was found at the time. The next step was to send the profiles to the National Criminal Investigation DNA database, integrated forensic analysis. But again, they didn't match any samples in the database, and the case remained cold. During the investigation, some people started to wonder whether the remains belonged to a man named Martin Wiberg, who was known to have stolen as many as 5,000 gold sovereign coins in 1877 before disappearing. Wiberg was asked to complete repairs aboard a ship called the SS Avoca, since he was an accomplished carpenter, but Wiberg saw an opportunity for a big payday. He made a wax impression of a key to the ship's strongboxes. He then duplicated a key, after which he traveled back to the ship to steal the coins, and he managed to get away with his haul intact. He filled the strongboxes with sawdust to account for the missing weight, and it would only be quite some time later that the missing coins were reported. Wiberg was eventually arrested and served 5 years in prison, but he would pass away after a small boat that he was in capsized near Waratah Bay, and it was assumed that he drowned since his remains were never found, and many of the gold coins have never been found to this day. But this was mere speculation, and investigators decided to turn to forensic genetic genealogy in hopes that the man could be identified at last. The DNA that could be extracted from the skeleton was sent to Othram in the Woodlands, Texas, and forensic-grade genome sequencing was performed. Once this process was completed and a DNA profile was created, it was sent back to investigators who were handling the case, and they uploaded the profile to a database of genealogical samples. This resulted in the very likely theory that Sandy Point Doe was, in fact, a World War I veteran named Christopher Luke Moore, who was known to be a farmer in the Gippsland area in 1928. And at last it seemed like there may be a break in the case. It was then discovered that Christopher had traveled to Waratah Bay with his family, which included his parents, Cornelius and Charlotte, as well as his brother, Francis, and his wife, Elizabeth, to spend some time next to the ocean. But tragically, when he went for a swim, he got into trouble and was overcome by the waves, causing him to drown and never be seen again. His family reported that the last sighting they had of him was when he threw his arms up in the air, possibly to call out for help, but he was struck by a large wave and never surfaced again. A man who was also visiting the beach at the time saw Christopher struggling and disappearing beneath the surf, and he bravely jumped in the water and attempted to swim out to where Christopher was last seen. But the tide was too strong, and he had to give up his efforts when it became apparent that he wouldn't be able to reach him. About 2 weeks after losing his life, a jawbone was found washed ashore, about 4 miles from Waratah Bay, and after Christopher's dental records were compared to the bone, it was determined to be his. His family decided to bury the jawbone in the family's burial plot, but they would have no further luck in retrieving the rest of his remains, and eventually his parents, wife, and daughter passed away without ever finding out whether they had been recovered. But now that they'd been positively identified as belonging to Christopher, the rest of his remains were also buried in the plot, and the mystery of the Sandy Point Doe had finally been solved, 95 years after Christopher vanished beneath the waves. This brought a certain amount of closure to the remaining members of Christopher's family, as they'd always heard stories about his disappearance, but never knew the exact details of what had transpired. For many years, they believed he'd been out fishing alone on the ocean, and that his boat capsized in the large swells, causing him to drown. But now they'd finally been given the exact set of circumstances that led to his passing. Home invasions don't typically end in tragedy, as the types of criminals who commit these crimes are usually just after a quick payday, and they tend to flee the crime scene as soon as they've pilfered whatever they deem to be valuable. These crimes are also typically committed when no one is home, as it's far less likely that the robbers will be seen and identified later. But sometimes a home invasion can go very wrong and it ends in tragedy. A good example of this being a case from 2012. In June of that year, 2 robbers decided to steal from a house in Crystal River, Florida, but their plans didn't quite work out the way they envisioned. Upon arriving at the house, which was presumably targeted because the resident was a 62-year-old woman, the 2 men decided to enter by kicking the front door down. This obviously made a lot of noise, and the woman immediately knew something untoward was going on. She started screaming, which alerted her son, who has also not been named since his safety is at risk, and he ran from the back of the house after picking up his firearm. Upon entering the front section of the house, he spotted the 2 would-be robbers, and all 3 men started opening fire on each other. One of the robbers, 25-year-old Sean Michael Wright, was hit, and the 2 criminals decided to flee. But only one got away, as Wright collapsed on the house's front lawn. The woman's son was also struck during the attack, and he was taken to a local hospital where he received treatment and eventually made a full recovery. Wright wasn't as lucky though, as he passed away while receiving treatment from paramedics, still on the front lawn. The second robber fled in a getaway car and was never identified. Wright's car, a black Ford pickup truck, was later found a few miles from the crime scene, but there's no indication that it was used during the home invasion. In a home invasion case from 2013 though, things turned out very differently, as a pair of robbers managed to flee from the crime scene, but not before ending the life of their victim, 21-year-old Destiny Renee Pitman. In this case, there's a good chance that the robbers knew their victim, and that they had a specific goal while attempting to rob the house, and they managed to get away with their crime for more than a decade before the case was finally solved in 2023. Though they never got what they came for. On the 7th of February, 2013, Destiny Pitman was living on James Drive in Kokomo, Indiana, along with her boyfriend who has not been named. What's known is that her boyfriend was selling illegal substances, and that the 2 robbers knew he had recently acquired more of the substance. They also knew that he had a substantial amount of cash on him, since he'd been selling a lot in recent times. What they didn't know was that he had taken both the cash and the illegal substances to a different house just days prior to the attempted robbery, and that they would eventually end up leaving without the items that they were after. Destiny also tried her hand at selling the substances, but when she inherited money from a family member who passed away, she no longer needed to. But since the 2 criminals were none the wiser to these facts, they went ahead with their plan. On that day, the 2 men broke into Pitman's house at around 9:30 p.m., not knowing that there were actually several people inside. A roommate who was living in the house told investigators that they heard a commotion somewhere in the house, and at first didn't know what was going on. But a few moments later, they heard Destiny opening her bedroom door, after which she confronted the 2 robbers, but this was a bad idea. The roommate then heard a single shot ring out, and they decided to hide since they didn't know who the men were and why they were there. The roommate never saw the 2 men, but told police that they believed they were African American, though this was by no means certain. Pitman's boyfriend also decided it would be best to hide, and all he saw of the 2 robbers was their shadows and part of a shoe that one of them was wearing. They then heard the robbers frantically searching the house, with one of them yelling, "Where is it?" And it became clear that they were after the $2,000 in cash and illegal substances that had already been moved to another location. Sources don't state who called the police, but when officers arrived at the scene, they found that Destiny was deceased and that the robbers had successfully fled, though nothing from the house had been stolen. Destiny's boyfriend then admitted that the robbers were after his ill-gotten gains and that Destiny unfortunately paid the price. Evidence was collected from the scene, including the single slug that was lodged in one of the house's walls, but they had very little else to go on and no arrests were made. Investigators continued to look into the case, but they were unable to find any further leads, and 2 years after Destiny's passing, they made an appeal to the public for anyone with information to come forward, but no one did, and the case went cold. The case would see no further progress for the next 8 years, until the 5th of December in 2022, when someone came forward to provide them with information that would finally bring the case to a close. Investigators received a voicemail from a person who had not been named, since they may be at risk of retaliation. In the voicemail, they stated that they were the 2 brothers, 32-year-old Joey and 36-year-old Jesse McCartney when they stated that they needed to run an errand. The informant decided to accompany them, not knowing what the errand was, and the three traveled to Destiny's house, which was situated in the 800 block of James Drive. The two men then got out of their cars, leaving the informant behind in Jesse's Jeep, which was parked directly in front of the house. They watched the two robbers enter the house and were shocked when they heard the sound of a firearm being discharged. Shortly after, both McCartneys came running out of the house and got into their vehicles before driving away. They added that when Jesse made it to the car, they noticed he was sweating heavily, and they knew that something sinister had happened inside the house. They also noted that he was holding a large amount of cash in his hand, along with a gallon-sized bag of the illegal substances that Destiny's boyfriend was selling. This made little sense since her boyfriend had already confessed to moving these items to a different house. But Destiny's boyfriend then explained that some of the substances that Destiny was selling were still present in the house, along with an unknown amount of money. When asked to describe the firearm that was used during the home invasion, the informant was able to do so, and they added that Jesse decided to sell his Jeep just 6 months after the robbery had been committed. The day after the incident, both Jesse and the informant drove past Destiny's house, and he described seeing a police scene tape that had been put up around the scene of the crime. When asked why they decided to come forward with this information more than a decade after the crime had been committed, they stated that their knowledge of the crime had always bothered them, and since there had been no developments in the case, they decided it was time to confess. After providing the statement, the informant was asked to take investigators to the crime scene, which they were able to do, and it became clear that they were being truthful. Following these developments, investigators showed photos of the two robbers to Destiny's boyfriend, who stated that he may have seen Joey before and that he may have been at the house in the past. Destiny's roommate was also interviewed again and asked about their statement that the intruders were African American, but they stated that they only made this assumption based on the voices that they heard. The informant was able to provide investigators with both of the robbers' whereabouts, and both men were quickly placed in custody. 10 years after they carried out the robbery and murder, they were both charged with conspiracy to commit burglary resulting in bodily injury, robbery resulting in bodily injury, and murder. At Jesse's trial, the jury took just 90 minutes to acquit him, while Joey's case has been scheduled to start on the 5th of December in 2023. Some criminals are very good at what they do, and they manage to get away with their crimes for years before being apprehended. In some cases, they're never tracked down, and this is usually thanks to the fact that they never talk about their crimes or the people they worked with while committing them. But then there are those criminals that take a little too much pleasure in the type of life that they lead, and this is often what leads to their downfall, as they can't resist the urge to boast about whatever nefarious deeds they've committed. One such case started in 2021, when police became aware of a vehicle robbery ring that targeted high-end cars in West Midlands County, England. They received reports of cars being stolen in Birmingham, Sandwell, and Solihull, and soon it became apparent that it was the work of a group rather than one individual. The stolen cars included 17 Range Rovers, 14 Audis, and an undisclosed number of Jaguars as well as Mercedes. All in all, the value of the cars that had been taken was estimated to have been around $4.8 million. Most of these vehicles were stolen during the nighttime while their owners were asleep in their houses, but others were forcefully taken, with one victim being forced to hand over their keys after they were threatened with a sharpened blade inside their house. Investigators were able to recover some of these vehicles, one of which was a Range Rover Sport that had been stolen from Selly Oak in 2021. Thankfully, the car's tracker activated after it was stolen, and it was abandoned by the robber, who was never identified since the car was found half an hour later. But one man named Oliver Cooper, a 23-year-old from Northfield, wasn't as lucky when he was spotted on CCTV cameras on the 8th of February 2023, 3 weeks after he'd stolen a Ford Fiesta. His undoing came about thanks to an automatic number plate recognition camera that picked up the stolen car's number plate, and police officers immediately gave chase. But Cooper managed to flee from the vehicle and escape, but not before this image was captured by a CCTV camera as he fled the scene. Pursuing police officers described tracking the car down and then seeing Cooper doing his best to get away. But when it became obvious that he couldn't flee, he opened the car's door while still driving along a busy street, before eventually abandoning it to escape on foot. Cooper was soon recognized and tracked down to his residence, and although he'd been caught for this particular crime, investigators would soon learn that he played a much bigger role in the robbery ring, since he had single-handedly stolen more than 30 cars over a one-year period. Incredibly, all the evidence that was needed to convict Cooper in 2023 came from his own cell phones, which were seized during his arrest, as he was in the habit of taking selfie videos of himself driving the cars that he had stolen. In one of these videos, he turns to the camera to show the interior of the car, but makes a crucial mistake as his face briefly appears in the shot. Investigators were able to isolate this image to make a positive identification, and along with this, they found more damning evidence on his phone, including the dates, areas, and times that he stole certain vehicles, the types of vehicles that he took, and more videos in which he can be seen driving the stolen cars. Once he was confronted with the gathered evidence, Cooper had no choice but to plead guilty to conspiracy to burgle and conspiracy to handle stolen goods. This resulted in him being handed a 6-year and 8-month prison sentence on the 8th of August, 2023. One spokesperson stated that if it weren't for the evidence that Cooper kept on his cell phone, they likely would have never been able to link him to the other vehicle thefts that he committed, and he would have received a much lighter prison sentence. It isn't known whether any of his fellow criminals have been identified or arrested, but there is a very good chance that they won't be making the same mistakes that Cooper did. Most robbers do a pretty good job at disguising themselves while they're committing a crime, since most homes and businesses have security cameras installed these days in an effort to prevent just such an incident. Those of us who have never committed a robbery might imagine that one of the most important rules among these criminals is to never wear any items of clothing that can be easily identified, since it would be a dead giveaway to their identity. But it seems that not all robbers think this far ahead. One case in point is a 24-year-old man named Terry Sullivan from Kent, England, who was part of a robbery ring that targeted businesses and houses in the area in 2012. The robbers had carried out a total of 6 robberies and 1 attempted robbery, the first taking place on the 4th of May, 2012, at Biggin Hill, when 2 men walked into a store and threatened the staff that worked there, resulting in them making off with over $6,000. Just a few days later, the robbers struck again. This time, 4 men entered a store located in Dover, and they produced a firearm with which they intimidated a staff member into handing over an undisclosed amount of cash and cigarettes before fleeing. Less than a week after that, they targeted a store in Eastbourne, specifically Hampton Park. The MO was the same as the second robbery, with 4 men entering the store while brandishing a firearm. This time they made off with around $2,000 in cash, but not before they were caught on a CCTV camera that showed one of the men wearing blue pajama pants containing images of cartoon-style monkeys. Just over a week later, the same 4 men entered a store in Larkfield, where they proceeded to force 2 staff members into an area at the back of the store, forcing them to open a safe containing more than $9,000 worth of cash, stamps, and merchandise, all of which was then stolen. The next 2 robberies took place in Gravesend and Chatham, respectively. These robberies resulted in over $5,000 in cash being stolen from the store's safes, and again, staff members working at these businesses were threatened with a firearm. The ring's last attempt at a robbery was carried out on the same day as the Gravesend incident, when they traveled to a house in Wrangle, Lincolnshire, but it didn't quite go to plan. The owner of this house was in the process of selling British Bulldog puppies, each valued at around $2,500. One of the robbers walked up to the house and asked if the owner would refill his water bottle, and as she did so, the 4 men entered the building. But the owner of the house was able to fight them off after throwing a chair at them, and the thieves fled without anything to show for their efforts. She would later be rewarded with a $300 reward for her bravery. The gang had done well for themselves, but this is when things started to unravel. Inexplicably, they decided to create a BlackBerry Messenger group that was entitled Armed Robberies, And in this group, they would often post selfies showing themselves with the cash and items that they had stolen, as well as the firearms used during the robberies. Sullivan had become a suspect in the crimes, and when investigators decided to raid his house, they found several cell phones that were then closely scrutinized, and they got the break that they were looking for. On one of the phones, an image was found in which Sullivan can be seen wearing the same blue pajama pants that were seen in the CCTV footage of one of the robberies, and his fate was sealed. This was all the evidence the police needed, and soon they started tracking down Sullivan's accomplices. They were discovered to be 24-year-old Thomas Balderson, 23-year-old Christopher Aldred, 31-year-old Christopher Heath, 24-year-old Daniel Jarrett, and of course Sullivan. Balderson maintained that he was innocent of the crimes, but the water bottle that had been left at the last attempted robbery contained his fingerprints, and these soon proved that he was indeed involved. It was found that the man used starting pistols, replica firearms, and kitchen blades to intimidate their victims, which was taken into account at their sentencing. Balderson received a 16-year sentence, and Aldred received a prison term of 13 years, while Heath was sent to jail for 6 years and Sullivan for 5 years, thanks to the pajama pants that made it possible to identify him during one of the robberies. Erica Ann Johnson, a 36-year-old woman from Cape Coral, Florida, mysteriously disappeared on the 5th of July, 2022, after stating that she was on her way to Tampa, but her case has finally been solved in 2023. At the time of her disappearance, Erica, who originally hailed from St. Louis, Missouri, was living near Cape Coral Parkway, and she was working at Best Western Plus Beach Resort in Fort Myers Beach, where she was employed as a housekeeper. On the 5th of July, the day that she went missing, Erica completed her shift at the beach resort at around 4:30 p.m., after which she got a ride to a bus stop in Fort Myers from a fellow employee. She then got aboard a bus later that afternoon and traveled to the Cape Coral Transit Center, where she was recorded by a CCTV security camera as she exited the bus at around 5:37, just over an hour later. The following day, her ex-husband received a text from Erica, in which she explained that she would no longer be visiting their 2 children, since she had to go to work, and he stated that this was highly unusual, since she never missed a chance to spend time with them. This led some people to believe that she was going through some type of emotional distress at the time, which caused her family great concern, and they started to believe that she may have gotten into a situation that she didn't know how to get out of. She would be captured on CCTV cameras at the transit center again 2 days later, and this time she had her luggage, a rabbit cage, and a pillow with her. She got on the bus at 5:21 a.m., after which she traveled to Fort Myers, where she was seen getting onto a Greyhound bus that was headed to Tampa. When her family had not heard a word from her over the next 6 days, they became concerned that something may have happened to her, and they decided to open a missing person case with the Cape Coral Police Department. Investigators did a check of the bus's schedule and found that it traveled to Tampa without making any stops, meaning that she couldn't have gotten off the bus somewhere along the way. During the investigation into her disappearance, the police managed to trace her to her intended destination, a bus stop in Tampa, and it was found that she had indeed gotten off the bus on the 8th of July. But this is where the trail went cold, and there was no further trace of Erica to be found. Her family and investigators tried reaching her by phone, but all their calls went directly to voicemail, and they started to fear that she might have fallen victim to foul play of some kind. Investigators then decided to check the room where she was staying, and there they found some of her clothing, a bicycle, a backpack, but no further clues as to her whereabouts. Their task was made all the more difficult by the fact that Erica wasn't in the habit of using her phone often, and she hadn't signed up to any social media platforms that may have provided some clues as to where she might be. She also didn't have any means of getting around other than public transport, as she didn't own a car. She also hadn't opened a bank account, making it impossible for investigators to track her via a debit card or ATM withdrawals. Erica had a history of suddenly leaving the area where she stayed, but her family stated that she always returned after a few days, and she hadn't done so on this occasion, so they became even more concerned for her well-being. For the next 10 months, investigators did all they could to solve Erica's strange disappearance, following up on every lead that came in and appealing to members of the public to come forward with any information that they may have. But no further clues were found, and Erica remained missing without a trace. During this time, her family remained hopeful that she would be found alive and safe, but as the weeks turned into months, it became ever less likely that this would be the case. But in May of 2023, all of that changed. Investigators announced that Erica had indeed been found safe in Ohio, and while they opted not to release any information on the circumstances under which she was found, her family stated that they were beyond relieved to learn that she hadn't fallen victim to foul play and that she was still alive. It isn't known whether she'll be returning to Cape Coral or if she'll choose to remain in Ohio, but her case was finally closed almost a year after she decided to get on a bus and vanish into thin air. Another strange disappearance that was finally solved after months of searching is that of 48-year-old Michelle Reynolds, who went missing while she was in New Orleans on the 23rd of September 2022. Michelle grew up in Louisiana, but moved to Orange, Texas in 1999, after she accepted a job as a teacher there. During this time, she met Michael Reynolds, whom she would eventually marry, and the couple would go on to have 3 children after relocating to Alvin, Texas. Both Michelle and Michael worked as teachers, Michelle teaching language arts to 6th graders at Fairview Middle School, while Michael taught at a school in the Alvin County School District. But not everything in Michelle's life was going as she had planned, as she'd been struggling with her mental health for the past 7 years, and at the time of her disappearance, she was taking medication and receiving treatment for an undisclosed incident that had taken place. Michelle had an appointment to see a counselor on the morning of the 22nd of April, which she attended, and she made her way home at around 9 o'clock, where she then spoke with her daughter. At around 12 o'clock that morning, she informed her daughter that she was going out to grab a bite to eat, after which she would be dropping in at the bank, and her daughter would later tell investigators that she saw her mother getting into a car and driving away. Her daughter headed back to school after lunch, expecting to see Michelle when she got home later in the day. But when she got home after school, she realized that her mother's car, a gray 2018 Lexus NX 300, wasn't there, and she could find no sign of her mother anywhere in the house. When Michael tried to contact her, he had no luck, and so he decided to open a missing person case with the Brazoria County Sheriff's Department, who immediately started an investigation. Investigators tried to track Michelle's car using the vehicle's geo-tracking device, and learned that she had driven in the area of New Orleans on the 23rd of September. They found this very strange, since the area is around 350 miles from her house, and they couldn't find any reason why she would have traveled to New Orleans, since she didn't know anyone in the area. But they were hopeful that they could make some progress in the case, as she was seen on CCTV security footage as she pulled into the parking lot on St. Peter Street. And when the footage was checked, they found that she parked the car, stayed seated inside for around 20 minutes, and then got out before walking away. Michelle's family stated that she seemed to be confused in the footage, leading them to believe that her disappearance may be linked to mental health issues that she'd been struggling with. The footage came as somewhat of a relief, since her husband and children thought she may have been carjacked and something untoward may have happened to her, but the footage showed that this wasn't the case. She was seen again later that day at around 4 p.m. as she was walking towards the Pontchartrain Expressway, but this is where the trail went cold and there were no further clues that could lead them to her. Investigators traveled to the area where she was seen getting out of her car, and they found that it was still there but had been abandoned. Strangely, when the car was searched, they found most of her personal belongings still inside, including her wallet, driver's license, purse, debit and credit cards, as well as her cell phone. They began to fear that Michelle may have ended up in the Mississippi River somehow, since her car wasn't parked too far away. But despite a thorough search being carried out on the river's banks, in the water, and from the air, they were unable to find any further traces of her. Michelle's bank account, social media accounts, and phone were all monitored, but nothing came of it as they saw no further activity. For the next month, Michelle's family could do nothing but hope that she would be found safe, and on the 1st of November, they learned that she had indeed been tracked down. It then came to light that Michelle had been living among the homeless population in New Orleans, and when a man whom she was eating with recognized her from a news report, he contacted the police, who then positively identified her. She was taken to stay with a family member who lived about 2 hours away from New Orleans until Michael was able to get her and brought her back home, and Michelle's disappearance had thankfully been solved. One would think that a criminal who's involved in illegal activities would try to keep as low of a profile as possible, not only to keep their identity a secret, but to ensure that they can carry on with their misdeeds without causing too much of a fuss and drawing attention to themselves. This should be especially true if they rely on other people to complete their crimes. But this isn't always the case, as some criminals believe themselves to be untouchable, and this is often the catalyst for them being apprehended and finally brought to justice. This is exactly what happened to two men, 26-year-old Peter Kavanaugh and 21-year-old Michael Adegoke, also known by the moniker Flaky, who ran an operation dealing in illegal substances between London and Weston-super-Mare, which are about 140 miles apart. For a while, everything seemed to be going swimmingly for the pair. Adegoke, a gang member, was the leader of the outfit who employed two women, 37-year-old Tracy Carter and 46-year-old Isabel Cristiano, to help him carry out his smuggling operation. But it was thanks to these two women and a callously taken photo that he and Kavanaugh were finally apprehended in 2013. Adegoke would arrange for the sale of the illegal substances, after which he would hand out orders to the rest of his population. He acted as an intermediary between the two areas, arranging for the illegal substances to be smuggled to Weston-super-Mare, where they were sold, and the money was then returned back to London, either as cash or by bank transfer. Once the illegal substances were ready to be dispatched, Carter and Cristiano would strap the products to different parts of their bodies using tape to conceal them as well as possible. They would then travel to the area where they were instructed to, where the products were sold, and the money then returned to Adegoke, who kept the lion's share of the profits, which totaled close to $37,000 per month. Kavanaugh seemed the more cavalier of the two criminals, as he can be seen in the photos that he took of himself while traveling back to London by train, kissing wads of cash that the group had made. But this would prove to be a major factor in the group's downfall. In September of 2013, the group's plans went awry when Cristiano and Carter were apprehended by police officers in Weston-super-Mare while they were in possession of selling the illegal substances on the street. When the two women were searched, police officers found an undisclosed amount of two different illegal substances strapped to their bodies and hidden under items of clothing, and they were immediately taken into custody. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that Carter and Cristiano were linked to Kavanaugh and Adegoke, and the two men were also soon arrested. When the four criminals' phones were checked, investigators found the photos that Kavanaugh had taken along with other equally damning images, and they realized the actual scale of the operation that Adegoke had been running. At the trial, the judge stated that he considered Kavanaugh to be nothing more than Adegoke's assistant, though he pointed at the sheer amount of illegal substances and money that had exchanged hands while the operation was ongoing. But Kavanaugh's lawyer pointed out that Kavanaugh had only decided to join Adegoke's operation because his brother owed the gang member an undisclosed amount of money, and he was attempting to clear his brother's debt. He added that Kavanaugh had seen the error of his ways since he was apprehended, and hence decided to enter a guilty plea, after which he would strive to live a sober and normal life away from crime. The judge took this into account and stated that he had originally considered sending Kavanaugh to prison for 4 years, but since he seemed regretful of his actions, he lessened the sentence to 3 years instead. Carter's lawyer stated that she was under immense financial pressure since her beautician business was failing, and so she resorted to a life of crime in an attempt to make ends meet and keep the business running. He added that she was attempting to raise more money so that she could buy Christmas presents for her children. As for Adegoke, his lawyer claimed that he is in fact a very intelligent man who struggled to see the difference between right and wrong, but this did little to dissuade the judge, who proceeded to sentence him to 5 years behind bars. Carter and Cristiano got off lightly in comparison, as they were each handed 2-year suspended sentences for their roles in supplying the illegal substances to members of the public. Between 1845 and 1852, More than 1 million people in Ireland lost their lives due to starvation and starvation-related diseases. About as many people left the island for the US, Canada, and Australia, hoping to escape the crisis going on back home. The Irish potato famine devastated Ireland. The country still hasn't reached population levels that matched that from before the famine. While there are still plenty of reasons why the famine hit Ireland so hard, the disease that caused potatoes to rot in the ground remained a mystery until 2013. For thousands of years, the potato was a stable crop in South America. When the Spanish explorers arrived in the area, they brought back the plants. At first, Europeans were skeptical of this foreign vegetable, but before long it became a staple on both sides of the Atlantic. The potato could grow in even the worst soil conditions and didn't need a whole lot of space. People could grow them in their backyards. It was also high in calories. It had roughly 3 times the caloric value of grain. It meant the crop was perfect for low-income farmers, which made it popular, especially in Ireland. In Ireland, a specific type of potato was grown, the Irish lumper. It wasn't a particularly special type of potato other than the fact that it was especially good at growing in poor soil. What was significant about the Irish lumper was that they were all clones of one another. There was no genetic variety in the plants, which all would have originated from the same potato plant. This meant it was extremely at risk when a potato disease arrived. The disease is believed to have come to Europe from the United States. It arrived first in Belgium and then spread to the rest of mainland Europe. It made the jump to Great Britain and then Ireland. For most of the continent, this blight was bad. It meant potatoes would turn black in the ground and degrade into a soft pulp that smelt terrible. Blight spread rapidly from plant to plant. The only way to stop it would be to catch it quickly. But this was a disease that had never been seen in Europe before. It would take a while for people to recognize the signs. But not every potato variety was susceptible to blight. Some were naturally resistant to the disease. Those resistant potatoes would stop farmers from starving and meant that the next crop would be made up entirely of the resistant potatoes. But in Ireland, there was no variety. The Irish lumper was susceptible to the disease. What was bad in Europe was devastating in Ireland. On top of this, the potato was the only food source for large parts of the population, as well as being used to feed cattle. Without this source, people couldn't eat. Policies from the British government only made things worse, preventing people from getting the help they needed. It wasn't until 1852, with improvements in crop varieties and an increase in food imports, that the famine finally ended. While the management of the famine and the resilience on a single crop have been debated over the 160 years since the famine, the disease that caused the initial trigger remained a mystery. Every plant scientist wrote in great detail about the disease. They described not only the look and smell of the edible part of the plant, but also the appearance of leaves that were something of an early warning sign. The disease is a water mold and is caused by fungus-like microorganisms. These microorganisms prefer cool, moist environments, which Ireland would have fit perfectly. This disease originated in Mexico, but like the potato, there isn't just one variety of this disease. Up until the 1970s, there was only one strain of this disease outside South and Central America, known as US 1. This strain was still the most common worldwide until the 1980s. For a long time, scientists guessed that the strain responsible for the Irish potato famine was the US 1 strain. But an analysis of the plants themselves would turn up something that scientists weren't expecting. Scientists at the time collected infected plants in herbaria. These are collections of preserved plants, dried and flattened, before being stored for future research. Herbaria from Germany's Bavarian State Collection for Botany and London's Kew Gardens were used. Between these two collections, specimens from as far back as 1845 could be collected, as well as more modern specimens. The aim was to find out what strain of P. infestans caused the famine, and how it related to modern strains of the disease. Researchers were amazed by how well preserved the plants were. This allowed them to collect DNA and to sequence the genomes of both the infection and the host plants. 11 historic strains and 15 modern strains of the disease were sequenced. The answers they got to this mystery weren't the ones they were expecting at all. It wasn't US-1 that caused the famine, but an entirely new strain that had never been identified before. It was given the name Herb-1. Herb-1 changed how scientists understood the evolution of this disease. Most of all, it showed just how quickly these new strains developed. Herb-1 was closely related to US-1, but it wasn't a mutated type of the more common strain. US-1 also didn't mutate from Herb-1. It seemed like the two had a common ancestor. While P. infestans originated in Mexico, the ancestor to Herb-1 and US-1 spread out, likely into the US in the early 1800s. From there, the ancestor evolved into the two different strains. Herb-1 was the first to leave the Americas in 1845, with US-1 spreading around the world in the early 1900s. Herb-1 survived for about 50 years before the strain disappeared. It's not closely related to any modern strain of the disease. The production of the resistant crops likely led to Herb-1 going extinct. Competition from its sibling strain may also have played a role. Scientists still aren't clear why US-1 was able to spread and cause problems for farmers around the world for decades, while Herb-1 was relatively short-lived. It may be that US-1 was simply better at infecting a large variety of potatoes. It wasn't as simple as removing the few susceptible varieties, as was the case with Herb-1. Thankfully, practices like selective breeding and fungicides make P. infestans less of a threat today. Unfortunately, the disease still causes crop failures in many parts of the world, but solving the mystery of the Irish potato famine has helped to develop our understanding of the disease. Hopefully one day this new knowledge will help to tackle these modern infestations. Earth should be the planet that we know the most about. It's the planet we've been exploring and studying for thousands of years. And while we've mapped out most of the dry land and much of the underwater world, there are still areas that have gone unexplored. Those unexplored places might hold the answers to many of the Earth's secrets. But even without being able to look at them, scientists have been able to figure out one of those secrets: the mystery of the Indian Ocean gravity hole. In the Indian Ocean, not far from the southern tip of India, is an area where the gravity is much lower than average. Gravity around the world varies depending on the thickness of the crust and the density of the mantle beneath. But nowhere is this difference as big as in the Indian Ocean. The area's official name is the Indian Ocean Geoid Low. It measures 3 million square kilometers. Here, the sea level is roughly 106 meters lower than average. Normally, people imagine the Earth as perfectly round. Mountains and valleys may cause some differences on the continents, but in general, these don't rise too high compared to the size of the planet as a whole. But the Earth is a lot more misshapen than it might look from space. For example, in areas of low gravity, the ocean's surface is actually lower than in areas with higher gravity. Even though the Indian Ocean Geoid Low is the most significant area of low gravity on the Earth, this difference in sea level still isn't high enough for people to see it while sailing across the water. It was only discovered in 1948 by Dutch geophysicist Felix Manesch. Manesch was doing a ship-based gravity survey, and this was when he noticed the low ocean level. For more than 70 years, the anomaly has puzzled scientists. Other gravity variations have been explained by the thickness of the crust or mantle, but those explanations didn't hold up for the Indian Ocean Geoid Low. Scientists knew that the answer to this mystery lay underneath the Earth's surface, but that wouldn't necessarily be much help. Our understanding of what goes on beneath the Earth's surface is always growing. It wasn't until the 1960s that the theory of plate tectonics was accepted by the scientific community. Up until then, this crucial piece of knowledge about how our world works was a mystery. One of the biggest problems was that even if it was obvious that Africa and South America fit together nicely, the mechanism that caused the two continents to drift apart couldn't be explained. Eventually, technology allowed us to examine the inside of our planet, revealing the systems in the Earth's mantle that moved plates along. That technology has never been physically looking at what is beneath the surface. The deepest man-made hole on Earth doesn't even break through the crust. Scientists haven't been able to send equipment into the mantle to try to analyze it, let alone get any deeper. The only way we know what's going on beneath our feet is by looking at waves that pass through the Earth. Earthquakes are the best for this. By measuring the time it takes for different kinds of earthquake waves to reach different areas, scientists can work out the different materials in the mantle and core. It was this technology that gave scientists the first clues about what might have been causing the Indian Ocean low geoid. The waves showed an area of low-density material in the upper to mid-mantle beneath the low geoid. That would have caused the low gravity, but that answer only left another question. What caused this low-density material? For a while, there was a theory that it had something to do with the movement of the Indian plate. 180 million years ago, India and Madagascar were attached to the east coast of Africa. They then broke away. India left Madagascar behind and moved at a relatively high speed north before crashing into the Eurasian plate. Of course, the area between India and Eurasia at that time wasn't just an empty space. This was the Tethys Ocean, an ocean that existed for millions of years. The plate beneath this ocean sank beneath the Indian plate. The theory was that this plate might have caused the low-density material, but normally oceanic plates are cold and dense. Another theory was that it might have had something to do with the superplume of magma. This is when unusually hot magma comes near the surface. These plumes have explained other areas of low-density material, but there was no plume under the Indian Ocean low geoid. There was, however, one nearby. The African superplume is what's responsible for the East African Rift. Over millions of years, it could separate the east coast of Africa from the bulk of the continent. Interestingly, scientists found that parts of the plume drift off towards the Indian Ocean. Finally, in 2023, scientists announced that they'd finally cracked the mystery. All the pieces of the puzzle were there, but finding out how they fit together wasn't easy. Scientists from the Indian Institute of Science and the GFZ German Research Center for Geosciences realized the mistakes that other researchers had made. Up until now, the focus was on what was going on underneath the Indian Ocean today. The scientists realized that they had to look back in time to figure out the answer to this mystery. Using computer software, a variety of different simulations were created, testing different ways the anomalies could have been created. 6 simulations led to the Indian Ocean low geoid, and all of these showed that both the Tethys plate and the African superplume were responsible for the anomaly. When the Tethys plate was pushed under the Indian plate, it sank into the mantle. It was cold and dense, which meant that it went deep, but it was also pushed towards Africa, back the way India had just come from, and as it did so, it dislodged an area of hot magma, which caused the superplume. Part of that superplume was then pushed east, causing the low-density material, which then caused the low geoid. At the moment, this is only a theory. Unfortunately, this isn't the sort of theory that can be tested in a lab. Instead, scientists would rely on waves from earthquakes to analyze the Earth's mantle in the area, looking for clues that might explain the history of the area. It's often said that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own oceans, but we know even less about what's going on beneath them. Solving mysteries like the Indian Ocean low geoid helps us better understand our own planet and the destructive forces at work around the world every day. A photo on the internet can cause a tremendous amount of trouble. Once something is out on the internet, it's hard to have any control over where it's sent next and who sees it. It would be reasonable to assume that most criminals on the run from law enforcement would be aware of this, especially if they'd been evading capture for more than a decade. But in recent years, there's been a large number of Italian criminals with ties to organized crime gangs that have been called out by their photo appearing on the internet. The most recent example was Vincenzo La Porta. La Porta isn't a name that most people would know, but in the 2000s and early 2010s, he was an important member of the Camorra in Naples. The Camorra is a mafia-style organization made up of clans that operate mainly in the region around Naples and Italy. Dealing with illegal substances, money laundering, and counterfeiting made them a concern to authorities around the world. But the level of control they had and still have in the Campania region is much tighter. There, racketeering and loan sharking have resulted in lots of businesses and residents owing money to the organization, with violence being enacted when that money doesn't come. Even the hospital isn't above its influence. According to a 2019 report, the San Giovanni Bosco Hospital in Naples was under the control of the Camorra, and used as a public meeting space for members of the criminal network. The private ambulance service was also under their influence. Laporta dealt with the white-collar side of the business. He was recognized as a promoter of a criminal association that was involved in systematic tax evasion, fraud, and swindling foreign suppliers. In 2012, Laporta decided that it was too risky to stay in Naples and fled the city. He was then added to Italy's list of the top 100 most dangerous fugitives. In his absence, he was convicted of criminal association, tax evasion, and fraud. Unfortunately, Laporta wasn't the only high-ranking member of an organized crime group that was listed as a fugitive in Italy. Many were and are much more dangerous, with national and international authorities searching for criminals involved in kidnapping and more violent crimes, as well as those involved in the schemes that helped fund the organizations. Many of these people, like Laporta, had been in the business for decades and had long criminal careers. But those careers were also much more interesting for the media to write about. Laporta managed to slip under the radar, while the more exciting criminals were featured on lists of most wanted fugitives. That didn't mean the police weren't investigating Laporta. They tracked his financial movements and what he was doing online. But Laporta kept his location a closely guarded secret. The police were just waiting for one slip-up, and that came in May of 2023. On May 4th, Napoli Football Club played Udinese in a Serie A match. Serie A is a top-tier division in Italy. That match was a 1-1 draw, but it was enough to secure Napoli and the Serie A title for the first time in over 30 years. The title led to incredible celebrations, both in Naples and in other countries. People who were born and raised in Naples but had immigrated elsewhere still supported their home team. Groups of Naples fans gathered to celebrate the championship. Photographs were taken to show how the historic win was being celebrated around the world. One of these photos was taken on the Greek island of Corfu, where Napoli supporters stood and cheered on a balcony near a restaurant. Flags of support in Napoli blue were hung from the railings, while the supporters proudly displayed white and blue scarves. This was the slip-up that police had been waiting for. The image that was later released to the public wasn't too clear, but the police knew who they were looking at. Wearing a baseball cap and holding up his Napoli scarf was Vincenzo Laporta. Italian police traveled to Corfu, where they worked with local authorities to identify the restaurant. From there, they were able to tail Laporta. They needed to make sure they actually had the right person. Laporta was 60 at this point and had no idea he was being followed. One day, as he left the restaurant on a motorized scooter, the police stopped him and he was arrested. Laporta had apparently settled down quickly in Corfu. He'd been working as a chef at the restaurant and kept a relatively low profile. Nobody around him would have known he was on the run from international police. He had even started a family there and had a 9-year-old son. Few details have been released in the case, but his lawyer argued that he suffered from heart problems, and if he were extradited to Italy, it would be damaging to both him and his family. In Italy, Laporta faces a prison sentence of 14 years and 4 months. He would be in his 70s by the time he was released. Amazingly, Laporta isn't the only mafia-style criminal who's been caught after their image appeared on the internet. Gioacchino Gamino was a member of the Sicilian Mafia group who escaped prison in 2002. He was arrested in Spain after his photo appeared on Google Maps. Another gangster named Marc Ferran Claude Biart was arrested after the police found his YouTube channel, where he hosted a cooking show with his wife. With millions of photos and videos being uploaded to the internet every day, sometimes without the subjects even knowing, it's likely this will continue to solve mafia-related mysteries for years to come. During the Second World War, submarine warfare played an important role for both sides of the conflict. Most stories of submarines during the war involved sinking enemy ships or supply vessels, but some went on more covert operations. Their missions were top secret, which only makes it that much harder to locate the boat when things go wrong. The HMS Triumph was missing for more than 80 years before it was rediscovered in the Aegean Sea in 2023. Solving the mystery of the final resting place of the boat would require solving the mystery of its final patrol. HMS Triumph was launched in 1938 and spent the first years of her service in the waters around Great Britain. In 1939, she struck a mine which destroyed 18 feet of her bow. Miraculously, everybody on board survived, and the sub managed to make it back to port for repairs. From 1941 onwards, she served on patrol in the Mediterranean Sea. There, she took on more covert missions. The primary focus of the Triumph and other submarines in the area remained on patrols. The Mediterranean was an incredibly busy place during the war. As well as Italy, there was occupied Greece and Yugoslavia, and fighting in many North African countries. Egypt was a major base for British and Commonwealth troops. It was the perfect battleground for submarines, but there were other roles the subs could play. The first was work for the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. This was the organization that focused on sabotage and sedation. They could use submarines to drop off agents behind enemy lines and pick them up once the job was done. For a while, the British records showed that this was the sort of mission the Triumph was on when it was last seen. By November of 1941, the boat had spent the year in the Mediterranean, but had just received news that it would be returning home. Sailors had spent time buying presents in Egypt and were excited to see their family again. But in December, there were new orders. Another mission needed to be accomplished, and the Triumph was the only spare vessel in the area. According to British records, the job was to drop off some agents in Greece near Piraeus and later pick them up. The drop-off went according to plan, but the boat never returned for them. Letters to the 64 crew members on board were returned, and by late January, the boat was declared lost. Decades later, the family members of those on board tried to piece together what had happened. All the records kept in the National Archives in London indicated that the last mission was the trip to Piraeus. But when Gavin Don of the Triumph Association went to Greece to search for the boat, he was told he was looking in the wrong place. The Triumph had been on another, even more secretive mission. It was a mission that the British authorities seemed happy to sweep under the rug. As well as SOE, there was another organization working on getting men in and out of Europe. MI9 was the agency responsible for extracting escaped prisoners of war. Egypt had become the destination of choice for escaped prisoners of war trying to get home. Many had made their way to Greece, where the situation was complicated. But getting from Greece to Egypt wasn't simple. Sympathetic fishermen would ferry escapees across the Mediterranean, but that put them at risk. Axis forces knew if a boat was away from home for more than 3 days, it had been making the trip to Egypt. If they returned, the fishermen would be punished. Authorities needed another way to get men out of Greece, and submarines were chosen. A new plan was put in place. Boats would take escapees to the island of Antiparos in the Aegean Sea and return in just a few days. They wouldn't raise the suspicion of the Axis forces. From here, the escapees would have to wait for a submarine at the end of its patrol to pick them up and take them to Egypt. This was done once successfully, but the second mission didn't go to plan. A deeper investigation into the events of 1941 discovered that HMS Triumph had been on a mission for both SOE and MI9. On December 30th, 1941, the submarine dropped off a few agents on Antiparos, as well as supplies. They told the escapees that they would be returning in 10 days at the end of their patrol to pick them up. In those 10 days, 2 things went wrong. The first was that someone on the island told Italian authorities about an Allied agent there. One of the agents responsible for organizing the rescue missions had been dating the daughter of a local. The local woman believed he was taking advantage of her daughter and contacted the authorities. When authorities arrived on the island, they found dozens of escaped prisoners of war, as well as Allied agents. One of those agents was George Atkinson. Atkinson had been sent by SOE to the island with a radio and a wireless operator. He would then transport them to mainland Greece, where he was to meet up with members of 2 different resistance groups to begin relations between them and the British government. This was on top of his work for MI9 at rescuing people. It was a lot to remember, especially as he had a list of Greek names he was unfamiliar with that he needed to contact. So the decision was made to write these instructions down. Atkinson was supposed to leave the instructions on Triumph, but he didn't. When he was captured on January 11th, these instructions fell into enemy hands. The second thing that went wrong would remain a mystery. The chaos that was happening on Antiparos didn't cause the disappearance of HMS Triumph. The Axis powers didn't know of the plan to pick up escapees until after the date when Triumph was due to return. The men who had been hoping to escape on the Triumph believed the submarine would return for them on the night of January 9th. They lit signal flares, hoping to attract the submarine's attention, but it didn't come. There was some hope that there had been a miscommunication, and it was actually January 10th when they were due, but January 10th came and went with no sign of the ship. Finally, on January 13th, most of the escapees and other agents on the island were captured. They never knew what happened to HMS Triumph. The last known record of the sub was found in German records, which reported a torpedo attack in Sunyo on January 9th. This is believed to have been the Triumph. The sub would then have dived and made its way to Antiparos. Somewhere along the way, something happened to the submarine. There were no records of it sinking anywhere, and that left a huge stretch of sea to search. The search for the Triumph became an important project for a Greek diver named Kostas. Kostas had located 4 other submarines before he found the Triumph. It was after he had located the wreck of another sub, HMS Perseus, that he first heard of the Triumph. After doing some research, Kostas became determined to locate the boat. After many years of searching, he and his team finally located the wreckage of the sub. They found that all the hatches were closed and the periscope was retracted. It had been in a deep dive when it had sunk. It's still not clear exactly what happened to the HMS Triumph. It may have hit a mine, which was not uncommon in the area, or one of its own torpedoes may have malfunctioned and caused the sinking. Whatever the case, the families of those who lost their lives on the ship were grateful that the mystery of its final location was solved. In October of 1999, Esther Reed packed up her life in King County, Washington, and left. She told her sister that she would stay in touch, but it would be years before anybody from her family saw or heard from her again. In that time, Esther had changed her name multiple times and lived multiple different lives. It was 2 unlikely things that caused Esther Reed, a con artist and master manipulator, to be caught. The first was a detective working on the case of another missing person. Brooke Henson disappeared without a trace on July 4th, 1999. She was last seen by her father, sitting outside their home in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. She had told him she was going to break up with her boyfriend and leave town. Brooke said she would be back in 5 years. Despite saying she was leaving town, her disappearance didn't sit right with her family, and they reported her missing. It was a slow start for detectives on the case, but eventually, Detective John Campbell started working on the case. Campbell went back through all the old leads. There was one obvious suspect, but there was no actual evidence linking Brooke's boyfriend to her disappearance, and Brooke's body was never found. Then, in July of 2006, he got a phone call from New York to say Brooke had been found. A resident had been looking to hire someone to do housework, and a young woman with the name Brooke Henson had applied. The employer searched Brooke's name on the internet during a background check and found she was listed as a missing person. They contacted the police, who went to visit Brooke. The woman claiming to be Brooke explained she had left home because she was a victim of domestic violence. She had made a life for herself in the 7 years since she had vanished, studying at Harvard and now enrolled at Columbia. Her story was convincing. New York police told Campbell to close the case. Adults are allowed to leave their families behind and disappear, but Campbell couldn't believe that Brooke Henson had gotten into Columbia University. She was a high school dropout who enjoyed partying. It didn't seem to fit the Brooke that he knew. The police were convinced to do a DNA test and arranged one with the woman claiming to be Brooke, but Brooke had vanished before the test date. This was not Brooke Henson, but Esther Reed, using her 3rd stolen identity that she'd adopted since leaving home in October of 1999. Reed had always been a bright child, excelling at chess at an early age. She was the youngest of 8 children, and most of her siblings were quite a bit older than her. Reed was reclusive at school and pushed the boundaries at home. By her teen years, her life started to unravel. She thought she was too smart for school and dropped out before graduating. Her parents separated and her mother passed away due to cancer. She'd been caught stealing with friends. After Reed moved in with an older sister, she started to steal from her family. In 1999, it led to her appearing in court and pleading guilty to theft. She vanished before she could serve her sentence. Reed would later claim that she just needed to get away. She took on the identity of Natalie Fisher, the sister of a boyfriend. The real Natalie Fisher was in Europe at the time. As Fisher, she traveled across the country taking out cell phone plans and credit cards under her fake name. She also met a man who was on the college debate team, and through him, she met Cal State debate coach John Brushk, who encouraged her to apply to the school. In 2002, Reed enrolled at Cal State as Natalie Bowman. She decided to abandon the Fisher identity, as the real Natalie Fisher was growing concerned about the mysterious bills she was receiving. Reed excelled at the university. Her philosophy professor believed she was one of the brightest in his class. She was also a talented member of the debate team, but in the spring of 2003, Reed decided that it was time to move on. She claimed she was a professional chess player and that she earned a living from the prizes at tournaments. During one of these tournaments, she attracted a stalker. That was her explanation for why she was changing her name and moving on. But none of it was true. Her new name was going to be Brooke Henson, and she'd gotten into an extension school of Harvard University. She studied psychology and criminology and had plans to become a lawyer. When she found out her grades were enough to apply for Columbia, Reed did just that, and again she used the name Brooke Henson. Reed studied at the university until 2006. It was then that she found out after the background check was performed. Reed fled from New York, changing her name again and disappearing. At the same time, investigators were trying to find out who this mystery woman actually was, and if she knew anything about Brooke Henson's disappearance. Investigators did more digging into Reed and what her aliases had been doing in the 7 years since she vanished from Washington. As well as studying at various universities and joining debate teams, Reed had dated many men around the country. Her relationships typically didn't last long, but she made an impression on many of the men she dated. Investigators spoke to many of the boyfriends and others who had met Reed. It was one of the parents of one of these boyfriends that were able to give investigators Reed's real name. Fred Fleischman had met Reed in 2002 as Natalie Bowman. While Reed was dating his son, he'd always found her a little unusual, especially around her car. When his wife accidentally hit it coming out of the garage, she refused to give them insurance information and wouldn't cash a check for the damage and refused to let the Fleischmans take the car to a garage. One day, while she was out, Fred had put a map in the glove box of Reed's car and found a number of driver's licenses for different women, including Esther Reed. He told investigators about this when they asked about the woman he knew as Natalie Bowman. But there was another aspect of the men Reed dated that interested investigators. Many of these men had ties to the military. There was a fear that Reed was a spy and had been dating these men to find out information about the military. In one instant messaging conversation, she told a boyfriend she wanted to see some plans he was making for his military science class. Esther Reed now appeared on America's Most Wanted and was on the Secret Service's list of most wanted criminals. The TV show 48 Hours hired a private investigator to try to find her. But it was a second, unlikely event that led to Esther Reed being caught. In early 2008, Reed had moved to a suburb of Chicago named Tinley Park. She was staying at a motel there. By this point, the police had managed to connect a car purchase to Reed, but only had the license plate number. As long as the license plate wasn't looked up, the car would go unnoticed. But on February 2nd, a robbery gone wrong resulted in the 5 customers at a nearby clothing store having their lives taken. The police were doing everything they could to find the criminal, including scanning every license plate in the area. Reed's car was flagged. When the police first arrived at Reed's door, she believed they were investigating the attack and invited them in. The truth about their investigation was then revealed, and Reed admitted who she really was. Reed was charged with fraud and identity theft. In court, she claimed she was trying to escape an environment where she couldn't survive. Her claim earned her no sympathy from the family of Brooke Henson. For a brief moment, they believed their missing loved one had been found alive. The revelation that this was just someone pretending to be Brooke was devastating, and Brooke Henson still hasn't been found. Reed was sentenced to 51 months in prison and was released in 2011. A large crater was found in the Arctic Circle during the summer where unmatched temperatures were on the rise in the area. This had been one of 17 craters of its kind found in the Russian Arctic since 2013. Of course, these mysterious holes bore a variety of bizarre theories, which included aliens and missile testing. These craters have left many people stumped as they appear randomly throughout Siberia. Around the edge of these holes, the earth would be torn, ice and permafrost would be found as well, and there were signs of scorching. To many conspiracy theorists, this was consistent with an alien visitation. But recently, scientists have investigated the case and have found something far more haunting and realistic than an alien invasion. A research team made use of a 3D model of the most recent crater, and with satellite images were able to find the crater was a result of an explosion that occurred between the 15th of May and the 9th of June in 2020. One researcher named Igor Bogoyavlinsky, who was part of the Oil and Gas Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, positioned himself on the edge of this 30-meter deep hole with his arms over the edge while he operated a drone, which he almost lost on 3 occasions. Luckily, he didn't lose the drone and was able to find caverns in the crater, which ultimately confirmed their theory. The theory was that there was a methane gas buildup in the ice, which caused a mound to build at the ground level until it finally exploded and left behind a gaping crater. While the exact reason for the methane gas buildup remains unconfirmed, it's hypothesized that it's due to climate change. The permafrost gradually begins to thaw during the extremely hot summers, which allows methane gas that's trapped in the soil to leak out, and inevitably causes a mass explosion. The lead scientist and geologist belonging to the Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology Center for Hydrocarbon Recovery of Moscow explained that climate change would have an impact on the chances of the gas blowout craters showing up across the Arctic. He further explained that the time of year when the mound had exploded was when there was an influx of solar energy causing the snow to melt and the ground to heat up, thus causing changes to the properties of the mounds as well as their behavior. The mysterious craters have mostly been found accidentally after helicopters had flown over the areas. These explosive mounds do present a threat to the populations of the surrounding region. When the explosions happen, chunks of soil and ice are thrown many meters away from the center of the hole. A lead scientist went on to say that we're being faced with a colossal force, which is created by high pressure, but the reasoning for this high pressure is widely regarded as a mystery, as no proven theories have come to light. He and his team of researchers had taken various samples to figure out what was happening. These explosive craters have also been compared to cryovolcanoes, which are volcanoes that can release ice chunks instead of lava. The mystery of these strange, large gaping holes was not the work of alien invaders, but actually the buildup of methane gas that begins to seep out, possibly an effect of climate change. The Indus civilization is said to be one of the earliest urban cultures of the Indian subcontinent. They're also referred to as the Indus Valley Civilization and the Harappan Civilization. It appears that the society existed around 2500 and 1700 BC, although the southern civilizations appear to have been around in the second millennium. 3 of the world's earliest civilizations include Mesopotamia and Egypt, with the Indus civilization being the most extensive. The Indus people had farmed a collection of various items from cotton to dates, and even established 5 cities with plumbing and sewer systems. The society had lived in a desert area 5,000 years ago, and this is where the mystery comes in. It seemed as though the ancient Indus civilization had survived without any nearby flowing rivers. The cities that had been established were situated near large glacier-fed rivers, but the Bronze Age Indus villages appeared to be far away from flowing rivers. This was strange to archaeologists, since urbanized Bronze Age villages would always be found near permanent rivers. They were situated northwards of the Thar Desert, between the Ganges-Yamuna and the Indus rivers. During the 1800s, geologists and archaeologists had found a dry paleo-channel, much like an old dried-up river, that traveled through these villages. As far as they were concerned, the river had dried up, and along with it, so did the Indus society, and to them, the mystery was solved. New research suggests that this assumption may be entirely inaccurate. It was found that this river had actually dried up more than 3,000 years prior to the formation of the Indus society in that area. Intriguingly, it was discovered that this ancient civilization relied on the monsoon flooding, which would be trapped in the clay of the old river valley. The water that would become trapped in the clay was so rich in nutrients and used for agricultural needs. The research team, led by an earth scientist named Ajit Singh from the Indian Institution of Technology Kanpur, investigated the case. Using methods involving satellite imagery and deciphering uranium to lead decay for zircons that were taken from various sand samples in the area, the team were able to deduce that there was a large river flowing through the Indus Valley villages, but it had definitely been before the villages were established by thousands of years. With the use of sediment sample analysis, it was also determined that 8,000 years ago this river traveled through the area before suddenly changing course. But the cause of this is still a mystery. But it suggested that the change was initiated by a decline in strength after the Indian summer monsoon. The directional change left somewhat of a scar known as the Paleo Channel. The researchers explained that the valley appeared to be the ideal area for development due to the stability of it in comparison to the Himalayan river belts, which experienced flooding that devastated previous settlements. Upon further research, Singh and the researchers found that there are fine-grained sediments in the Paleo Channel, which have been interpreted as silt deposits deriving from smaller rivers that developed into a funnel system from monsoon waters draining out of the Himalayas. As a result of the strengthening and weakening of the monsoons, a stable area of land developed where villages would be less at risk of damage, and their crops would have a higher chance of surviving after major flooding. The researchers stated that the river dynamics had controlled the distribution of the Indus villages in the area, but in an opposite way than what was previously presumed. It had been the drying up of a river that initiated the growth of the Indus civilization, rather than the arrival of it. Another team of researchers was involved in uncovering the mystery as to how the Indus civilization was able to survive for so long without a flowing water source. The lead scientist was Sanjeev Gupta, who is a sedimentologist at Imperial College London. Gupta and his team of researchers drilled cores into the riverbed and sliced them in half lengthways in order to retrieve a semicircle piece to be analyzed. The samples would be used to identify the sediment, as well as reveal the ages of them. While analyzing the grains, it was found that there was a match to another river, the Sutlej. Just like Singh, Gupta's research revealed that the river had once been flowing in the area but shifted course, leaving behind the Paleo Channel. This is known as avulsion, which sometimes occurs with rivers. It's yet to be determined when exactly the Sutlej River went off course, but for the time being, it appears that the mystery has found its solution. With extensive research, it was found that the Indus civilization did not require the flowing river, but intelligently harvested the trapped waters in the clay from the heavy flooding caused by monsoons. A green and gold-covered book unveils a strange cipher within. This is known as the Copial cipher, consisting of 105 pages and 750,000 characters in total. Each of these symbols has been meticulously inked into the pages of the book. This incredibly long cipher went unsolved for 260 years. The book was written in the 18th century and contained a blend of handwritten characters. It uses a mix of Roman and Greek symbols, among other symbols. In 2011, the coded pages were finally deciphered. It took a bit of digging to discover who the creator of the manuscript was, but it was not too much of a battle. Through historical research and linguistic analysis, it was revealed that the Copial cipher manuscript originated in Germany and belonged to a secret society. The strange writings had brought up some questions as to the purpose of the manuscript. Was the cipher a way of protecting secret and sensitive information? Or was its intent to be used as a challenging intellectual exercise for the smartest individuals during that time period? Rumors quickly spread about what the contents of the cipher may reveal. Some guessed at secret maps leading to a hidden treasure, or a lost language that had been forgotten. One theory that remained consistent was centered around secret societies, where some individuals suggested that the message may be the inscriptions of the workings of the secret society. Perhaps the society related to the Templars or even the Freemasons, but nothing could be revealed until the code was finally cracked. years of failed attempts by cryptographers left the resistant cipher unsolved, until the combination of linguists and computer scientists' efforts. A computer scientist named Dr. Kevin Knight, along with a linguist named Dr. Biera Mageshi, are the ones who ultimately led to the breakthrough. They had with them a library of 500 languages and a frequency database while they began to analyze and pattern recognize the coded manuscript. Knight and Mageshi's approach to solving the case made use of automated methods and linguistic intuition. They identified and distinguished between repeated characters and analyzed their frequency, as well as cross-referencing the symbols with other languages in the 500-language database. Some characters linked up with Germanic words and slowly began to reveal their contents. The Roman characters appeared to be null. The Copial cipher continued to have its layers removed in order to reveal the hidden message, which led to the answer as to what it had contained for so many years. The manuscript proved rather interesting, but it was also strangely mundane. The ciphered text contained ritualistic and ceremonial accounts of the secret society, the inner workings of the initiation rite, philosophical underpinnings that had guided their actions, as well as organizational structure had been detailed in the text. They were also able to figure out who exactly the secret society was. They had been an organization known as the Occultists, which was a gathering of ophthalmologists, which are eye doctors. The society had been led by Count Frederick August von Veltine. Through the interpretation of the cipher, it's believed that the group may have been linked to Freemasons, but had created a new society and passed on Masonic rituals and rites to the members. The secret society was banned later on by Pope Clement XII, which would account for why everyone would go through the process of ciphering the manuscript. In the first 16 pages of the document, a strange occultist initiation ceremony is revealed. It explains that potential members would be asked to read from a blank paper, and when they said they could not read it, they would be given a pair of glasses and encouraged to try again. They would then have their eyes washed with a cloth if they still could not read it, and then have a ceremonial operation where a single eyebrow hair would be plucked from them. The mysteries of the cipher revealed a mix of intellectual abilities and technological mastery. While the cipher did not harbor any incredible secrets, it did give us a look into the past, and offered an insight into the hidden areas of human beings as a society. The Copial cipher, which is an incredibly long manuscript, proves that we're capable of unraveling even the most trying of tasks, and strangely enough, it also reveals that optometrists may lead a secret life that we do not know about. The manuscript initially appeared as though it was something out of fiction, with the strange written characters and handwriting, but it was soon revealed that the yellowing pages held the secrets of the occultist society. The Abominable Snowman, or Yeti, is depicted as a snowy region Bigfoot or Sasquatch, which looks like a white-haired ape-like cryptid. This creature is said to inhabit areas such as the Himalayas, making up part of the Himalayan mythology and occasionally receiving reports of supposed sightings. There have even been odd markings found in the snow that have been accredited to the beast. The Yeti makes up part of the urban legend section, and some individuals maintain that this legend is based on fact. In recent years, new clues have come to light that may finally solve the mystery of the Abominable Snowman. A study was conducted by a group of researchers where a series of DNA analysis were carried out. 24 hair, tissue, and other samples have been collected in the Tibetan plateau of the region. It was determined that about 9 of these samples had come from the supposed Yeti. These samples had actually indicated evidence that the owners of the DNA had been Himalayan brown bears, and one of these samples appeared to have come from a dog. Initially, the research project began when the scientists had discovered genetic similarities between ancient polar bears and the apparent Yetis. This discovery led them to believe that the mythical Abominable Snowman had actually been an unidentified bear. A researcher named Charlotte Linkvest at Sunny Buffalo had been looking for Yeti-related relics which came from the remains preserved at some museums, and some which came from native people who had collected some of these samples, while others had been obtained by Linkvest when working on a 2016 documentary called Yeti or Not, which included singular tooth and hair samples that had been found in the 1930s. Scat had also been collected from an Indian mountaineer, Reynolds Mesner. More hair samples had been discovered by a nomadic herdsman, while a leg fragment came from a spiritual healer in Tibet. These collected samples were then tested against DNA from bears and other mammals that reside in the area. This led to 9 of the samples matching up with the Tibetan brown bear, the Asian black bear, the Eurasian brown bear, and one of them being linked to a dog. The focus fell on the mitochondria structures. This had led to the sequencing of the first ever mitochondrial genome of the Himalayan brown bear. The team of researchers wrote that these samples had strongly suggested that the biological basis for the Abominable Snowman is the brown and black bears that are found in the area. Additionally, more studies have been conducted relating to the North American Bigfoot, where the collected fibers came from horses, dogs, bears, and even people. The Yeti is now believed to be some sort of relative to the Himalayan black bear, as well as the Himalayan brown bear, which were thought to be very genetically distant. Researchers suggest that the supposed footprints believed to be the Yeti may have been footprints from this unidentified bear. In 1921, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Bury released a book that told the story of his journey near Mount Everest. In the book, he described track marks that appeared to be those of a barefoot man, and he attributed them to a wolf walking through the softer snow. But his Sherpa guides explained that the prints had been left by a man-bear snowman. It's possible that the native people of the area had simply seen an elusive, unidentified bear, or perhaps a deformed one making its way through the snow. It's also been suggested that since male and female bears share different hibernation patterns, it may be hibernating for longer periods, which accounts for the very rare sightings. In the 1950s, there were 2 expeditions that took place in search of the elusive being, and out came the supposed sightings, footprints, and hair samples. Other samples of the Yeti had been previously sequenced, with one of the notable ones involving a geneticist named Brian Sykes. Sykes explained that based on his research, no DNA matched up to modern bears, brown bears, or black bears, but had in fact connected to a polar bear dating back 40,000 years ago. His suggestion stated that these abominable snowmen were actually just an unknown hybrid bear species, and he later published these results in a scientific journal. It was not long before he was met with criticism, which stated that he was hypothesizing way too much from a single piece of a mitochondrial gene. Once the documentary Yeti or Not aired, Dr. Linkvist revealed in it the last results that indicated that the Abominable Snowman was in fact some sort of bear. She expressed that there may have been a bit of disappointment that went along with this, since it was a whole decades-long myth that was suddenly debunked. And so the mystery of the age-old Himalayan myth of the humanoid bear-like creature was laid to rest by the scientific explanations that arose with the help of DNA testing and sequencing. Edgar Allan Poe was a great poet and writer, but he was also a man of many mysteries. Before his passing, Poe left us with many indulging books, with one of them holding a small secret within. The Gold Bug was a short story written by Poe and published in 1843. The main character is William Legrand, who finds a golden beetle that he believes would change his luck. In this short story, a short coded cipher can be found which left many people stumped for ages. The cipher was made up of numbers, brackets, punctuation marks, a dagger, and a double dagger symbol. The short story was not only a compelling read, but had been an introduction to cryptography. In the story, Legrand had come across a peculiar cipher, but Poe never explains what it actually means, and so it's left up to the readers as well as Legrand to figure it out. Poe had explained how the cipher should be decoded, and also gave the solution, but some individuals found that it may prove more rewarding if they solved it for themselves. The coded message made use of monoalphabetic substitution, and in order to solve this puzzle, one would need to know what letters correspond with each symbol used in the cipher, which made use of all 26 letters of the alphabet. The coded message was eventually solved, though it's unknown as to who had deciphered it entirely on their own, and there have been a few errors in more copies of the book which led to misinterpretations. This message revealed another strange encryption that was later dissected by Legrand to make a bit more sense. The cipher read, quote, "A good glass in the bishop's hostel in the devil's seat, 41 degrees and 13 minutes northeast, and by North Main Branch, 7th limb east side. Shoot from the left eye of death's head. a beeline from the tree through the shot 50 feet out. However, in another solution, it was 21 degrees and not 41 degrees. As more investigations were done, it appeared that the most accurate version would have been the message that used 41, and the 21 had come from misprints, which made very little sense until some more digging was done. It was found that the bishop's hostel had been an area of rocks on the mainland on which a narrow ledge could be found. This ledge was referred to as the Devil's Seer. With the use of a telescope and the bearing that were given the cipher, Legrand was able to see an item among the branches of a large tree, which is where the supposed treasure would be found. Poe had conjured up many strange ciphers that he would publicize for readers to enjoy. The puzzles use logic, calculations, and strange symbol interpretations in order to be solved. Edgar Allan Poe had introduced readers to the world of deciphering messages, and there are many more waiting to be solved. One may even use Poe's descriptions and explanations on how to solve some of these ciphers, such as messages that use monoalphabetic substitution, such as in The Gold Bug. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.